Hey guys, tonight we step back into the shadowy streets of medieval Europe. Not to marvel at castles or legends, but to discover why survival then was a brutal, relentless test that most of us wouldn't last a single day in. While medieval times shaped history with knights, feasts, and epic tales, they also hid grim realities, disease, superstition, and punishing daily routines that would break the toughest modern soul. So, before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy uncovering history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and which era you think you'd actually survive in. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket for comfort, and let's journey back together. The senator who lost everything. Because he bet on gladiators, Rome's greatest men sat side by side in the marble shadows of the Colosseum, cloaks drawn tight, eyes fixed on the sand below as the day's games spiraled towards their bloody climax. For senators, generals, and patricians, these spectacles were far more than entertainment. They were obsession, status, and sometimes ruin. There is one story, still whispered, of a senator whose pride, wealth, and entire legacy were gambled away in a single fevered season, all because he believed he understood fate. Imagine this. Gaius Septimus Regulus, a senator with a family line stretching back to the Republic, a man whose ancestors had ridden in triumph through the Forum, sits stiffly upright in his private box. The roar of the crowd shakes the stone around him. Every gesture in the arena below, every sweep of a trident, every flash of blood, echoes in his pounding heart. Yet for men like Regulus, these games had become something else entirely. A market of risk, where fortunes changed hands as quickly as the lives on the sand. In the Rome of the 1st century, betting was not a vice. It was practically a virtue among the elite. Senators wagered on everything. The color of the next horse to win, which gladiator would fall first, whether a condemned prisoner might survive 3 rounds with a wild beast. Reputation in the Senate itself was sometimes determined not by laws passed or alliances forged, but by who could predict the next champion, who could see through the noise and trust their own instincts. Regulus, renowned for his confidence and shrewdness, built his identity around such certainties. At first, he bet small. On the Murmillo with the quick footwork, the Retiarius who always played to the crowd. But then came Tigranes, a giant Thracian slave turned gladiator whose string of victories seemed unstoppable. Tigranes had the look of destiny about him, and Regulus became convinced this man would win it all. Every bout Tigranes survived, Regulus doubled down. He sold off an estate outside Capua, then his wife's jewelry, family heirlooms centuries old. Servants whispered, but Regulus silenced them with a look. "This is how empires are made," he said, on the strength of a single, perfect risk. His rivals, sensing blood in the water, fed him inside tips and whispered rumors. Some cheered his luck. Others plotted his downfall. The city buzzed with gossip. Would Regulus stake his last denarius on the Thracian giant? The games grew wilder. Senators leaned in, their rings glittering as they pressed coins and IOUs into the hands of bookkeepers. Regulus became the symbol of noble risk, of the intoxicating danger that separated men of power from mere spectators. And then, as Rome always does, the city demanded a sacrifice. The day of the Grand Championship arrived. Tigranes entered the arena as a favorite, odds so lopsided that betting against him felt like madness. Regulus watched with the rapt gaze of a gambler whose entire soul hangs on a single dice roll. But that afternoon, the gods favored chaos. Tigranes slipped in his own blood. His opponent, a nameless, battered Gaul, struck a killing blow that seemed to freeze the world. The crowd gasped, then howled. Regulus collapsed to his knees. In an instant, everything changed. The estates, the heirlooms, the connections, gone. Creditors demanded payment. His rivals in the Senate moved against him, smelling weakness. Regulus's family fell into disgrace, their name spat in the streets as a cautionary tale. Once a patron of poets, he became their warning, a figure in tragic verse, the senator who lost everything for a moment of certainty in the sand. But the lesson runs deeper than one man's ruin. Roman culture was addicted to risk, obsessed with chance, and in the hands of the powerful, gambling was a ritual of status and masculinity. The amphitheater was their market of fortune, and men like Regulus wagered more than coin. They staked their very identity, seeking meaning in chaos, believing they could see patterns where none existed. The historian Suetonius records stories of emperors who wagered provinces and armies, of senators who staked ancestral homes on a single throw, of fortunes built and broken on the turn of a gladiator's luck. Why? Perhaps because, for the Roman elite, power itself felt like a game, unpredictable, cruel, and always watched by the crowd. Risk was proof you were alive. Even as Regulus faded into obscurity, his story survived. For every new senator who boasted that he could read the future in a man's stride or the shimmer of a sword, there were dozens who remembered the fall, the silence after the last bet failed. Rome was a city of winners, but it never forgot the price of losing. And so the Colosseum remained, echoing with laughter, with screams, and with the memory of fortunes lost in a heartbeat. Even centuries later, as ruins crumbled and empires faded, the shadow of men like Regulus haunted every gamble, every risk, every hope pinned on the unpredictable. Because in the end, the games were never just games. They were Rome itself, magnificent and merciless, offering glory and ruin in equal measure to those bold enough or foolish enough to bet everything, the merchant bankrupted by a single bad shipment. Picture the medieval docks at dawn, the air thick with the brine of the sea and the clamor of ambition. Here, fortunes rise and fall on the tides, and every merchant knows that one bad shipment can end a legacy that took generations to build. Among these risk-takers stands a spice merchant whose story would become a whispered warning in the annals of trade. A man whose pursuit of rare riches would lead not just to ruin, but to the loss of everything he was. His name has been lost to the salt and mist, but his fate was not unique. In an era when cinnamon and pepper were worth their weight in gold, traders like him gambled with more than money. They gambled with their families, their names, and their very place in the social order. Every crate of spice, every roll of silk, represented not just cargo, but hope and risk bundled together. He had clawed his way from obscurity, starting as a minor apprentice in the Guild of Merchants. Through relentless work, deft negotiation, and a measure of calculated charm, he built a trading house known for its daring routes and reliable shipments. Over years, his warehouse filled with treasures: pepper from the Malabar coast, nutmeg from Banda, ginger from Java, saffron from the Levant, exotic goods that demanded immense capital but promised astronomical returns. Yet every voyage was a bet against the sea. A merchant could insure his cargo, bribe harbor masters, and hire the best crews, but he could not bribe the weather or control fate. When he arranged his greatest shipment, a fleet loaded with rare spices destined for the courts of Venice and Bruges, he staked not only his reputation, but every coin he owned. He borrowed, mortgaged properties, and promised future harvests to financiers and family alike. The manifest read like a king's ransom: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, cardamom, packed in chests and barrels, a fortune riding on the wind and the skill of a few trusted men. On the day the ships departed, the entire city watched. Merchants and competitors, bankers, and dock workers all could sense the magnitude of the risk. Success would make him one of the most powerful men in Europe. Failure would erase him. Weeks passed. Letters arrived from distant ports, first with good news, safe passage past pirates, favorable winds. Then silence. Then, as dread crept in, word of disaster. A storm in the Bay of Biscay, winds that rose like the wrath of old gods. One by one, the ships vanished. No survivors, no cargo, not even wreckage washing up on foreign shores. The city's mood shifted from envy to fear, and then to pity. Creditors closed in, demanding payment. Workers and partners distanced themselves, as if ruin was a contagious disease. His house was seized, his family name dragged through the mud. The same people who toasted him at feasts now avoided his gaze in the market. The merchant tried to recover, offering what little he had left, trying to bargain his way out. But medieval debt was a brutal thing. Bankruptcy meant more than financial loss. It was social annihilation. His guild revoked his membership. Old friends became strangers. In the harsh logic of the era, a single misfortune erased a lifetime of trust. What stings most is that this fate was not rare. Thousands of merchants, across centuries, gambled their entire lives on the mercy of winds, waves, and luck. Insurance was in its infancy, and the law offered little protection. If the shipment was lost, the merchant lost not just his goods, but his honor, his standing, and even his freedom. Some ended in debtor's prison, others vanished into exile, their stories serving as cautionary tales for generations. And yet, the drive to risk everything for that one chance at glory persisted. For every merchant ruined by a shipwreck, another rose to wealth through a twist of fate. The line between legend and ruin was a single voyage wide. The spice roads were lined with invisible graves of men and fortunes. Each cargo lost was a small apocalypse for someone, a thread cut from the great tapestry of commerce that built empires and changed diets, tastes, and politics across continents. To be a merchant, then, was to dance with disaster, to know that one wrong turn, one furious storm, could undo decades of labor and ambition. We remember the rich and successful, but history's undercurrent is shaped by those who lost it all in silence. The merchant bankrupted by a single bad shipment is the ghost behind every luxury we now take for granted, every taste of pepper or cinnamon that cost someone everything. His story is a reminder. Behind every market, every trade, every taste of the exotic, there are those whose dreams sank beneath the waves, lost forever to the sea. The nobleman who ruined himself. Throwing lavish feasts. Imagine a world where your very identity depended on the thickness of your tablecloth, the aroma of roasted meat drifting into the night, the flicker of candlelight on golden platters, and the unspoken calculation of every guest. This was the world of the nobleman, a world where a reputation could be lost or won in the span of a single night, determined not by sword or treaty, but by how many courses you served and how many mouths you fed. In medieval and early modern courts across Europe, hospitality was more than a duty. It was a display of raw power. To withhold a feast was to admit defeat in the unending war of status. The finest families measured themselves by the spectacle they could provide. The more exotic the foods, the rarer the wines, the more distinguished the entertainment, the higher their prestige. Yet beneath the music, the laughter, and the clinking goblets, a quieter, more dangerous contest raged. A contest that would ruin lives, erase fortunes, and leave once mighty houses in the gutter, mocked by the very people they once dazzled. Consider the real history of the English court under Elizabeth I, where noblemen vied for favor through ostentation. The Earl of Leicester famously spent entire fortunes entertaining the Queen and her court at Kenilworth Castle, days of music, theater, masks, and endless feasts, with fountains spouting wine and rare fruits imported from across Europe. Guests wandered through gardens where every path was calculated to impress, and no detail was too small to escape his notice. But for every Leicester who won the Queen's smile, there were countless lesser lords who emptied their treasuries and pawned their lands for a fleeting moment of envy. Sometimes, the very guests who applauded your generosity by night would mock your bankruptcy by day. One tragic example lies in the archives of France, where the nobleman Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's own superintendent of finances, held an infamous fête at Vaux-le-Vicomte. The banquet was unparalleled. Hundreds of guests, rivers of champagne, fireworks that lit up the sky. Yet the Sun King himself, feeling overshadowed, destroyed Fouquet, stripping him of wealth and freedom. But for every Fouquet, there were 100 minor nobles whose names never reached history books, who fell into debt and obscurity just to avoid seeming small. In Renaissance Italy, the spectacle grew even more feverish. Banquets lasted for days, with living statues, mechanical marvels, and courses that mimicked the wonders of distant lands. Peacocks arrived at the table with their feathers ablaze. Dishes were molded to resemble mythical beasts. Behind the scenes, servants scurried to hide the debts their masters could never hope to repay. Venetian chroniclers speak of families who squandered inheritances on a single wedding feast, believing that ruin was preferable to shame. As the debts mounted, creditors circled like wolves. In one notorious case, a once prosperous Florentine was seen begging in rags outside the very palace where he once presided as host. Across Europe, the pressure only grew. Nobles were expected to maintain open house, their doors always open, their tables always full. Declining a visitor or hosting a modest meal risked whispers of poverty. Hospitality became a trap, a performance without end. The Spanish court of Philip IV was infamous for its extravagance, with entire provinces bled dry to supply the royal banquets. Gold plate was melted to pay for candied fruits. Silverware was pawned to afford one more evening of applause. But what drove these men to such ruin? Partly, it was desperation, a knowledge that status was fragile, that a single rumor of stinginess could end a family's rise. But it was also hope, the hope that one banquet might win a powerful ally, secure a marriage, or catch the eye of the king or queen. More often, though, the only reward was hollow praise, envy that curdled into mockery the moment the money was gone. When the debts became impossible, the fall was swift and brutal. Noblemen lost their lands, their servants, their homes. Some fled to distant provinces. Others were imprisoned for unpaid debts. But perhaps the cruelest fate was to become a laughingstock, a cautionary tale whispered at the tables of those who once envied you. There are records of ruined hosts returning to their old haunts, begging for scraps from the same kitchens where they once ruled, their names now a byword for foolishness. Historians now see these lavish feasts not as simple vanity, but as a kind of social arms race, each nobleman trying to outdo the last, even when the price was self-destruction. The banquet was both a ladder and a precipice. To refuse the game was to accept obscurity. To play it was to dance on the edge of disaster. If you listen closely to the stories left behind, you can still hear the echoes, the laughter, the music, the distant clatter of plates and goblets. You can sense the anxiety beneath every toast, the silent calculations behind every gesture of generosity. For in the world of the noble feast, ruin was never more than a few courses away. The very act of hospitality became a trap, closing around those who could least afford to escape. And in the end, The greatest spectacle was not the banquet itself, but the slow, public unraveling of those who gave everything for a taste of fleeting glory. The potter who was sued into oblivion. Over a cracked vase. In the winding streets of a medieval city, under the shadow of cathedral towers and the sharp gaze of town criers, there lived a humble potter named Gervais. His workshop was cramped, thick with the scent of clay and the tang of ash from his kiln. To the bustling market, Gervais's vases were a small miracle, vessels glazed in deep cobalt blue or streaked in earthy browns, coveted for their elegance and the way they caught morning sunlight. He had learned his craft from his father, who learned it from his own, and every piece carried with it generations of whispered technique, secret recipes for glazes, and the silent hope that each sale meant survival for another week. But medieval life for craftsmen was always precarious. Behind every transaction lay a web of risk, a society quick to judge, where status was fragile and ruin could come in a single moment. One morning, as Gervais finished polishing a delicate vase, a servant in fine livery appeared at his door. The local noble, a man whose word was law in these streets, had heard of Gervais's skill. The noble's wife desired a vase for her chamber, one to impress the visiting bishop. Gervais poured all his pride into that piece, layering glazes, firing it at just the right temperature, careful to avoid the tiniest flaw. When the noble's men came to collect it, they inspected it with cold, practiced eyes. Payment was swift, but with it came a warning. Should the vase disappoint, Gervais would answer for it. Days passed. At the noble's banquet, the vase was filled with lilies and displayed for all to see. Yet in the heat of celebration, a servant, perhaps clumsy, perhaps only unlucky, brushed against the stand. The vase teetered and fell, shattering into jagged shards on the polished stone. The laughter of the guests froze. The noble's pride was wounded in front of rivals. Anger needed a target. The potter, it was said, had sold a flawed vase, a vessel unworthy of noble halls. Whispers grew into accusations. Soon, Gervais was summoned before the city's magistrate. Medieval law was rarely kind to craftsmen. Guilds protected their own, but only if a craftsman was in good standing or held influence. Contracts were ironclad, and nobles carried weight no artisan could match. Gervais pleaded that the vase had left his hands perfect, that any breakage must have come from mishandling. But the noble's word was worth more than his. Evidence mattered little when reputation was at stake. The magistrate pronounced judgment. Gervais was liable for the noble's loss and public humiliation. The penalty? Compensation far beyond his means. As word spread, former customers withdrew. The market women whispered that Gervais's kiln was cursed. He sold his tools, his meager savings drained. When he could not pay, bailiffs seized his home. Gervais watched as the kiln, the heart of his trade, was broken to ensure he would never fire pottery again. In the alleys where he once walked with pride, he became a warning, a ghostly reminder that one mistake, or even the mere accusation of a mistake, could erase a lifetime of honest labor. He lived out his days on the margins, his name recalled only in cautionary tales told by other craftsmen to their apprentices. But the story of Gervais is not unique. In the tightly regulated towns of medieval Europe, craftspeople existed at the mercy of both their patrons and the law. Consumer protection, in its earliest forms, was enforced with terrifying severity. If a baker's bread was found to be underweight, or a blacksmith's tools failed, the penalties ranged from fines to public shaming. Or worse, nobles and wealthy merchants demanded perfection, and even natural accidents could be construed as fraud. Medieval guilds sometimes offered support, but just as often, they expelled anyone whose misfortune threatened the reputation of the trade. Trust was currency, and a single public failure could unravel a craftsman's entire existence. The tale also exposes the power imbalance that shaped every facet of daily life. Nobles rarely faced consequences for their actions, while the poor and the skilled but powerless bore the brunt of legal retribution. The idea of product liability may seem modern, but its origins are laced with tragedy. Every pot, every loaf, every iron tool bore not just the hopes of the maker, but the threat that failure, real or imagined, meant social death. Even centuries later, the ruins of Gervas's kiln and the echo of his ruin linger in the stones of forgotten streets, a silent testament to how fragile security truly was for those whose hands shaped the world, but whose voices were too soft to matter when the powerful felt slighted. The priest who stole temple funds and was sold into slavery. In the shadowed heart of the ancient city, where incense mingled with the anxious whispers of supplicants, a priest in flowing robes once stood at the center of trust and ritual. He was the keeper of sacred keys, the voice of the people before the gods, the silent witness to every offering and confession. To ordinary citizens, the priesthood seemed above the frailties of common men, chosen for purity, immune to temptation. Yet beneath the marble columns and painted ceilings, even those sworn to serve the divine could fall prey to the darkest of human desires. The story of the priest who stole temple funds and was sold into slavery is a tale not only of personal downfall, but of the chilling power of public shame and retribution in a world where the boundary between sacred and profane was thinner than a whisper. It began with small thefts, perhaps. A coin here, a jewel there, taken from the overflowing baskets left at the altar by the hopeful and the grieving. Who would notice, he reasoned, when the gods were showered with such plenty? But greed, once tasted, rarely rests. Soon the thefts became bold, the priest keeping careful count of offerings, inventing clever lies in the temple records, building a secret life from the devotion of others. The temple coffers dwindled, and whispers grew. Pilgrims and townsfolk alike sensed something was amiss. The lamps burned less brightly, the feasts grew sparse, and repairs went unfinished, while the priest's own robes gleamed ever more splendidly. Rumors swirled in the marketplace and at the city gates. One day, a devout widow brought more than a mere offering. She brought suspicion. When her donation vanished without a trace, a quiet investigation began. The elders, driven by equal parts faith and fear, set a trap. They watched as the priest, thinking himself unseen, slipped coins into his robe. The betrayal was confirmed. His hands, once raised in blessing, now trembled with guilt as he was seized before the altar by his own brethren. The punishment had to be exemplary, for this was not just a crime against the people, but against the gods themselves. The trial was public, held at the temple's grand steps, with the entire city summoned as witness. There, in full view, the priest was stripped of his sacred vestments, each layer peeled away until only a simple tunic remained, no longer set apart, no longer holy, just a man laid bare before his neighbors. His head was shaved, his symbols of office smashed at his feet, a stark reminder that the gods do not forget. But the penalty did not end in humiliation. In ancient custom, repayment for stolen temple wealth demanded more than the return of coins. It demanded the surrender of the self. Unable to repay the full debt, the priest was sold into slavery, a fate reserved for the lowest and most desperate. His price was set at market, not as a dignitary, but as a common household laborer, the proceeds used to replenish what he had taken. Those who had once bowed their heads for his blessing now averted their eyes as he was led away in chains, a living lesson etched into the city's memory. Slavery in this era was not simply punishment. It was erasure. The priest's name was struck from temple rolls, his family shunned, his past deeds wiped away as though he had never served. In the home of his new master, he performed menial tasks, perhaps even for families he had once blessed. Every day was a reminder of what he had lost, not only freedom, but dignity, identity, and the trust of an entire people. For the city, his downfall was a warning, a whispered tale retold for generations that no one, however high their office, is beyond the reach of justice or the eyes of the gods. The story of the priest who stole and was sold is more than ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every age. It asks what we value, how we guard trust, and what price we demand for betrayal. In a world built on faith, even the smallest theft becomes a cosmic wound, and punishment, a chilling blend of spectacle and suffering, serves both to cleanse and to terrify. The city moved on, its rituals resumed, but the echo of his footsteps in chains haunted the temple for years. This is the fate that awaits those who dare to steal from the sacred, not just loss, but a total undoing, played out in the gaze of gods and mortals alike. The farmer who couldn't pay the grain tax and lost his land. In the sun-beaten fields beyond the city walls, the life of a Roman farmer was measured by the grain he coaxed from the earth. He worked with cracked hands and aching back, his eyes fixed not just on the sky for rain, but always on the distant road, half dreading the day the tax collectors would arrive. For centuries, the grain tax was the empire's lifeblood. Rome demanded wheat, barley, or whatever harvest you could scrape together, sometimes measured in impossible quotas, always in the name of the Senate and people. For the peasant, it was an inescapable shadow, a burden handed down like a curse from father to son. Imagine Gaius Flavius, a man born on his father's patch of dusty land. His entire world is a small farm carved out of wild scrub, where each sunrise brings the hope of just enough. He knows the rhythm of planting, the prayers for rain, the desperate bargaining with neighbors when drought threatens. For families like his, land is everything: ancestry, security, and identity. It's all he can offer his children. But each season, after the sweat and toil, comes a moment of dread: the arrival of the taxman. Roman taxes were harsh, but the grain tax was merciless. The state demanded a fixed share, regardless of weather, pestilence, or plague. Fall short, and officials arrived, cold-eyed, flanked by local enforcers, clutching ledgers filled with names. They didn't want excuses, they wanted grain, and if there was none, they wanted payment in kind: animals, tools, or the very soil beneath your feet. Even one failed harvest could tip the scales from solvency to disaster. In the year of a bad drought, Gaius Flavius watched his fields burn under a cloudless sky. The earth cracked, wheat withered, and the granaries stood nearly empty. When the collectors came, Gaius tried to reason, to plead for mercy. He showed them the shriveled stalks, offered the little grain he'd stored for his family's bread. But the empire was unyielding. Rome had armies to feed, officials to pay, distant cities to keep loyal. No tax meant no future, not just for the farmer, but for the machine of empire itself. The officials marked his name. They seized what little was left: his best ox, his iron plow. But it wasn't enough. On their next visit, they brought a magistrate, a few soldiers. In front of his neighbors, with the weight of Rome behind them, they declared his debt unpayable. The farm, his father's land, was taken by the state, auctioned off to a wealthier neighbor, or granted to a loyal veteran. In an instant, Gaius became a tenant, or worse, a laborer on what had once been his own fields. His family lost everything. He was not alone. Across the empire, thousands of farmers suffered the same fate. One failed harvest, one bad year, and generations of work vanished. The loss rippled outwards. Some families drifted to cities, joining the faceless poor. Others wandered as beggars, or fell into debt slavery. Rome's elite grew richer, buying up failed farms and consolidating them into vast estates worked by former owners. Rural communities withered, and the backbone of the empire, the independent farmer, slowly disappeared. The grain tax was more than a fiscal policy. It was a weapon, a way to squeeze the countryside for every ounce of value, a force that shaped Roman society in ways that echo even today. Ancient historians record the laments of the dispossessed, men who once stood proud on their land, now exiles in their own home, victims of a system that cared only for the numbers in a ledger. Yet, for every Gaius Flavius, there were countless others, their names lost, their stories buried under the weight of imperial ambition. But the lesson remains. In Rome, your fate could turn on the weather, on the whim of officials, on a handful of grain owed to men who never set foot in the fields. The grain tax was merciless, and it changed the course of families, villages, and even the empire itself. The gladiator who became a star and then lost it all to wine. Imagine the roar of an ancient Roman arena, sunlight glinting off steel, the sand beneath stained by years of sweat and blood. In these amphitheaters, legends were not born, they were forged. Among thousands who fought, one gladiator's rise and fall would echo through time. A man whose name was once shouted by crowds, who touched immortality, only to lose it all to the lure of wine, ending penniless in the shadow of the very gates that made him famous. He began his life as a nobody, a slave dragged from a distant province, thrown into the brutal world of the ludus. The trainers saw something in him, a ferocity, a stubborn will to survive. He was given a stage name, an identity crafted for the mob. Fight after fight, he survived. He learned to read his opponents, to play to the audience, to become more than a killer. He became a performer, a living myth. With every victory, his reputation grew. Soon, he was no longer a faceless slave. He was the champion of the arena, the Lion of Rome. A title that echoed in the taverns and whispered markets. Senators wagered fortunes on his bouts. Women threw flowers at his feet. Children imitated his walk in the alleyways. Gold flowed his way, not just prize money, but gifts from wealthy patrons who sought the reflected glory of a living legend. With each triumph, he gained new privileges, freedom from the worst punishments, the right to dine with nobles, even a home of his own. But this new world was treacherous. The parties began, invitations to Roman banquets where the wine flowed as freely as applause. At first, he drank in celebration, to numb the pain and memories of violence. But soon, the wine became a ritual, a nightly escape from the growing emptiness that followed each fight. Fame in Rome was a fickle god. There were always new fighters, new spectacles to dazzle the crowds. After each battle, his victories felt emptier. The sponsors who once filled his purse grew distant. Whispers about his drinking grew louder. In the arena, his reflexes dulled, his footwork slowed by hangovers. Losses crept in, then humiliation. His fans, hungry for invincibility, turned on him with the same savagery they once used to worship. He tried to reclaim his glory. He swore off drink, then relapsed. He promised the crowd a comeback, but each defeat brought more scorn. His savings vanished on wine, gambling, desperate attempts to revive his celebrity with lavish gestures. Old friends vanished. His villa was sold to cover debts. In a cruel twist, he found himself performing not for senators, but for petty thieves and drunks in dingy bars near the city walls, where he traded stories of past victories for a cup of cheap wine. The end was as brutal as any fight. One cold morning, he was found slumped against the arena gates, the iron bars cold against his back, no coin in his pocket, no friend by his side. The city that had once given him everything now had nothing left for him, not even a grave with his name. He died penniless, his body taken away with barely a whisper, another forgotten casualty of Rome's insatiable hunger for heroes and spectacles. But his story did not vanish. For years, gladiators whispered his name as a warning. His rise and fall became a lesson of how the very gifts of fame and fortune could become shackles, and how the greatest enemy a man might face is not in the arena, but in himself. In the end, the crowd moved on. New names took the stage, and the arena sand was raked clean. But beneath it, the memory of the man who had it all, and lost it to wine, remained. A silent ghost haunting the empire's greatest games. So when you think of Rome's heroes, remember not just the victories, but the cost. Every triumph in the arena was paid for in blood, and sometimes the deepest wounds were carved not by swords, but by the slow, seductive poison of the city itself. The gladiator who lost everything is the face behind the mask, the echo behind every cheer, a reminder that glory is fleeting, and that the fall from greatness can be as sudden and total as a blade across the throat. The woman who borrowed for jewelry and was thrown in jail. Imagine a city of marble and noise, where fortunes and reputations were as fragile as the gold filigree winding through a wealthy woman's necklace. In ancient Rome, where status ruled every waking moment, personal adornment was more than a luxury. It was an unspoken language, a passport to power and visibility. Women, especially those in the higher ranks of society, were judged by the brilliance of their rings, the weight of their earrings, the intricate designs of their necklaces. But what happens when the hunger for status collides with the hard reality of debt? This is the story of a world where women could borrow vast sums for the sake of glitter and silk, and where one ill-timed default could lead straight to the misery of a Roman jail cell. The Roman elite moved in a world where appearances meant everything. In the forums, at public games, and in grand feasts, a woman's worth was measured, sometimes literally by the gleam of gold at her throat. Lenders and jewelers, often far shrewder than any senator, learned to prey on this obsession. They offered lines of credit, sometimes quietly, sometimes with brazen pride, knowing that most noblewomen would risk anything rather than be seen without the latest trend. Many had husbands too busy or indifferent to notice their wives' mounting debts, but the system thrived on silence and shame. Unlike men, women rarely had full legal control over their finances. Still, loopholes abounded, and ambitious women found ways to sign their names, promise future dowries, or offer up pieces of family property as collateral. One of the most infamous cases involved a matron whose name, carefully hidden by her embarrassed relatives, survives in legal fragments. She was seen at every banquet, every festival, always wearing a new necklace, each piece more lavish than the last, each acquisition a new promise to repay. Behind closed doors, her lender's patience wore thin. The debts ballooned, interest compounding like a storm over the Tiber. When payment didn't arrive, the jeweler went to the magistrates. Unlike today, Roman law allowed creditors to demand swift justice. Within days, the woman was dragged from her home, past servants who averted their eyes, past neighbors whose whispers grew sharper with each step. Her crime was not theft, but default. In Rome, a broken promise could be prosecuted with the same cold force as a stolen purse. The public humiliation was brutal. Instead of gold, she wore chains, her jewelry replaced by iron. Imprisonment for debt was no symbolic punishment. The Tullianum, Rome's infamous jail, was cold, dark, and unsparing. Its cells held traitors and murderers, but also debtors, citizens who had overreached, whose ambition had outstripped their means. For a woman of status, It was a fate worse than poverty. The scent of perfumes was replaced by the stench of damp stone, the music of banquets by the groans of other prisoners. Meanwhile, Roman society watched and gossiped. The same women who once envied her necklaces now spoke her name with scorn, grateful it wasn't their turn. Her family, desperate to salvage their name, worked to repay the debt, often selling lands, pawning heirlooms, or seeking favors from powerful friends. Sometimes, a sympathetic relative or an embarrassed husband would cover the loss. Other times, the prisoner simply vanished from records, a casualty of the city's insatiable hunger for spectacle and scandal. Why did women risk so much for mere decoration? The answer lies in the invisible architecture of Roman life. For many, jewelry was a shield and a weapon. It signaled wealth, lineage, and marriageability. It could win influence, deflect suspicion, or even attract political allies for the family. Roman writers like Juvenal and Martial mocked this obsession, warning of ladies who value gold above virtue. But behind every joke was a real fear, that even the highest born could fall if they lost their grip on appearances. The marketplace for status was ruthless, and every woman who bought on credit knew she was walking a knife's edge. Laws would eventually change, but the stories remained, a warning echoing through the centuries. In Rome, to borrow for beauty was to gamble with your future, to risk not just money, but freedom, dignity, and reputation. The woman whose love for gold sent her to jail became a lesson passed down in hushed tones. Yet, her story was far from unique. In the city of Rome, countless women lived and lost by the shimmer of a necklace, the promise of a lender, and the silent threat of an open cell door. Even now, the ghost of her story lingers in every luxury we covet, in every risk taken to impress a crowd that may, in the end, only remember our fall. The moneylender who was ruined by a friend's default. In the maze-like alleys of a bustling medieval town, behind painted shop signs and cathedral bells, moneylenders moved with a mix of caution and ambition. Their work was both essential and despised, feeding the arteries of commerce, yet drawing suspicion from every quarter. Among these was Abelard, a careful man with ledgers inked in midnight and a reputation built on trust. He understood risk, measuring out loans in exchange for pledges and sureties, always wary of ruin's shadow. But Abelard believed in the bonds of friendship as much as the iron law of numbers. It was this belief, in a world where paper contracts and a man's word mingled dangerously, that would prove his undoing. One spring, a childhood friend named Henry approached, eyes alight with dreams of expanding his trading venture. Henry needed funds, more than any one merchant would lend, but lenders in that era demanded a guarantor, someone whose name would vouch for the debt. Henry turned to Abelard, pleading that he co-sign. The law was clear. If Henry failed, Abelard would be liable. But the memory of shared bread, laughter, and hardship swayed Abelard's judgment. He signed his name, believing trust could bridge any risk. For a time, Henry's venture prospered. Ships arrived, warehouses filled, and the promise of profit seemed real. Abelard relaxed, relieved his faith was justified. Yet beneath the surface, the tides of commerce turned dark. Plagues disrupted trade routes, storms sank vessels, and debts mounted in secret. Henri, too proud to confess, borrowed further, doubling down on disaster. One morning, a courier arrived not with payment, but with the news of ruin. Henri's business had collapsed under its own weight. Creditors, sensing blood, moved instantly. Abelard was summoned before the city's magistrates. The law of surety, written in crisp Latin and enforced with brutal precision, left no room for mercy. To guarantee a debt was to own it, A friend's default was as binding as one's own. The court ordered Abelard to pay the full sum, plus interest and penalties. His pleas for compassion, his argument that he'd gained nothing, that the collapse was beyond his control, meant nothing. Custom was merciless. In order to keep trust in the marketplace, someone had to pay, and Abelard's signature was as good as gold. So began his descent. The house he'd worked years to buy, with its painted shutters and tiled roof, was auctioned to the highest bidder. His ledgers, tools, and even the cloak from his shoulders were seized. He watched as his own fortune unraveled not because of his own folly, but because of loyalty to a friend. Old clients crossed the street to avoid him. Some whispered he'd been reckless. Others pitied him, but none could help. The laws of debt and surety, meant to protect commerce, did not distinguish between misfortune and malice, accident or betrayal. Henri, the friend whose default caused the disaster, vanished into exile, leaving Abelard with nothing but the echo of past trust. The town's moneylenders, once eager for his company, now eyed him as a cautionary tale. They learned to trust no one completely, to require ever more elaborate guarantees. Abelard, meanwhile, drifted through the city's shadows, unable to find work or shelter. In the taverns and counting houses, his story grew, how even the sharpest mind and the purest intentions could be wrecked by another's fall. But Abelard's tragedy was not rare. Throughout history, the law of surety has been a double-edged sword. Medieval Europe, with its patchwork of statutes, forced lenders and friends alike into cruel dilemmas. Families were torn apart when a single member's debt dragged everyone into poverty. There was no safety net, no legal forgiveness, no bankruptcy as we know it today, only endless repayment or social death. Debtors' prisons and public auctions were routine. The risk of ruin lurked not just in bad luck or poor judgment, but in misplaced trust. The market's need for certainty demanded that someone always paid the price. The law's logic was cold. To guarantee was to risk everything, and friendship, when written into a contract, became a trap from which few escaped whole. The echo of Abelard's fate lingers in the cobblestones and old walls of forgotten cities, a warning that the debts we guarantee for others can destroy not only fortunes, but entire lives, and that trust, once lost, leaves only ruin and silence behind. The shopkeeper who was robbed and couldn't pay rent. In the pulsing heart of the ancient city, where the clamor of the marketplace rose each morning like the dawn itself, every stall and shadow held a story. Among the weavers, spice vendors, and bakers, one humble shopkeeper made his living selling bolts of cloth, silks dyed in vibrant reds and deep blues, linen smoothed by careful hands. His stall was small, wedged between a potter and a fishmonger, but he took pride in the order he kept and the honest reputation he'd earned. Each morning, he swept his floor, arranged his goods, and whispered a silent prayer that the day's trade would keep misfortune at bay. Yet in cities built on commerce and competition, luck was a fickle guardian, and disaster was never more than a heartbeat away. The attack came swiftly, beneath the cover of dusk, when most vendors had closed up shop and the alleys were empty, except for the hurried steps of the desperate. Thieves slipped through the canvas flaps and with practiced hands tore through the shopkeeper's wares. They took the finest silks, the precious imported dyes, even the small coffer of coins he hid beneath his bench for emergencies. By the time the night patrol arrived, the stall was gutted. The shopkeeper left kneeling in disbelief among scraps and scattered threads. The city's laws were clear. Merchants were responsible for their own protection, and losses to theft were shrugged off as the price of doing business. The next morning, the market bustled as always, but the cloth seller's stall stood empty, its shelves bare, his face haunted and pale. He pleaded with his landlord for leniency, explaining the theft, showing the broken lock and the ruined goods. But the marketplace had no patience for weakness. The rent was due by sundown. No exceptions. Without stock to sell, the shopkeeper's hands were tied. He watched as his rivals prospered, the crowds flowing around him, oblivious to his plight. As the hours slipped by, desperation grew. He borrowed what he could, pawning the tools of his trade, the very scales he used to weigh cloth, even the clothes on his back. Still, the sum fell short. When the bell tolled for evening, the landlord arrived, not with sympathy, but with city guards. The stall was seized in full view of the market, its sign pulled down and its goods, what little remained, confiscated to pay a portion of the debt. The shopkeeper, once a respected part of the forum's daily rhythm, was cast out with nothing but his empty hands. In ancient times, a merchant's livelihood was as fragile as a thread. There were no safety nets, no insurance policies, no recourse but the mercy of the community, a mercy that rarely appeared. The forum stones became the shopkeeper's world. He slept beneath awnings and begged coins from those he once greeted as customers. Pride faded into hunger, and the city, so full of opportunity for those with luck or means, turned cold and indifferent to his fall. Each day, he watched as new vendors took his place, shouting their prices, bartering for silver, weaving the same dreams he once held close. But even in ruin, his story lingered. Some market folk remembered his honesty and left a crust of bread or a worn tunic in the night. Others whispered warnings to apprentices, "Guard your goods, for fortune is fickle, and all it takes is one moment for a life to unravel." In time, the shopkeeper's tale became a caution passed from father to son, from master to apprentice. A reminder that in the bustling heart of the ancient marketplace, security was an illusion, and every merchant walked a razor's edge between prosperity and ruin. For the city, the story of the shopkeeper who was robbed and left begging was both a tragedy and a lesson. It revealed how the fates of ordinary people could shift with the turn of a key, the slip of a knife, or the whim of those in power. It exposed the silent cruelty woven into the fabric of city life, where compassion was a luxury, and survival demanded both cunning and luck. Long after the stall was gone and the shopkeeper's voice faded into the crowd, his struggle remained etched in the forum's memory, a silent testimony to the precariousness of honest labor and the merciless justice of the marketplace. The banker who lent too much to a noble and was beheaded. Picture a city where fortunes are made and lost in whispered bargains, where power wears 1,000 faces, and justice depends on who holds the heavier purse. This is Rome at its height, a place where senators rule, emperors dream, and in the smoky corners of marble halls, men like Marcus Lucius Varro risk everything for a seat at the table. Marcus is not a senator. He is not a general. He is something even more dangerous, a banker, one of the silent architects of Rome's glittering machine, the man who loans money to the mighty, expecting only repayment and a little fear in return. In ancient Rome, banking was an art of survival. The city pulsed with commerce. Senators gambled on grand estates, merchants built fortunes on risky shipments, and the common man borrowed to escape poverty or to chase dreams. But among the wealthy, debt was a weapon. Powerful nobles borrowed freely, confident that their names alone would protect them from consequence. For men like Marcus, the only hope of survival was caution. Never lend too much. Never demand repayment too loudly. Never forget your place beneath the patrician boot. But ambition has its price. Marcus saw his moment in the person of Decimus Aelius, a senator of ancient blood, infamous for his extravagance and taste for risk. Decimus wanted land, horses, parties that outshone emperors. Marcus lent him sums beyond reason, certain that the prestige of his client would draw others, nobles eager to borrow from the man who dared bankroll the city's boldest senator. The debts grew. Ledgers filled with promises. Marcus began to whisper of repayment. Decimus laughed it off, promising new estates, new investments, always tomorrow, always out of reach. The weeks became months. Marcus's own creditors circled, hungry for the money he no longer had. Finally, desperate and emboldened by justice, Marcus took the unthinkable step. He sued Decimus Aelius in the courts, demanding repayment. For a moment, the scales seemed balanced. The city gossiped. Would a banker really challenge a senator in public? Some admired Marcus's courage. Others warned him that in Rome, power always writes its own rules. The trial was a farce. Decimus, draped in purple, sneered at the accusations. He called Marcus an upstart, an enemy of tradition, an insult to the dignity of the Senate. The crowd jeered. The judge, himself a client of the Aelius family, listened in silence, then pronounced Marcus guilty, not of fraud, but of insulting a senator's honor. In Rome, such a crime was unforgivable. The verdict was swift and brutal. Execution. They dragged Marcus through the forum, his pleas lost in the clamor. His friends vanished, his allies melted away. The law, designed to protect the weak from the powerful, became a blade in the hands of his enemies. In the shadow of the Capitol, Marcus Lucius Varro was beheaded. His crime not theft or treason, but daring to hold a senator accountable. The lesson echoed through every counting house, every market stall. In Rome, the rules were different for those with power. Nobles borrowed freely, secure in the knowledge that law was just another privilege. Bankers, merchants, and tradesmen learned to weigh risk not just in coin, but in the shifting winds of patronage and revenge. Marcus's death was a warning etched in blood. The man who lends to a senator must be willing to lose more than gold. Yet his story was not forgotten. In back rooms and smoky taverns, men whispered of the banker who dared defy a noble, who chose justice over fear, and paid with his life. Some saw him as a martyr, others as a fool, but all agreed on one thing. In Rome, the line between profit and ruin was thinner than a blade, and the scales of justice could be tipped by a single, powerful hand. Centuries later, the ruins of Rome still remember Marcus's fate. His name survives not in monuments or marble, but in the quiet terror that creeps through every deal, every loan, every hope for fairness in a world ruled by the ruthless. For in the end, Rome's bankers learned what every empire teaches in time. The price of courage is always highest when the powerful are forced to pay. The slave who bought freedom, but had no job to pay debts. In the shadows of ancient cities, where the stones themselves remember names lost to history, there is a story that quietly upends the fantasy of freedom. It begins not with the crash of battle or the drama of revolt, but with a single exhausted man clutching the hard-won proof of his liberty. A simple document, signed and sealed, that marks the difference between being someone's property and being a person. For centuries, slaves who earned or bought their freedom were celebrated as examples of hope. But for many, the moment the chains were struck off was the start of a new captivity, one far crueler because it looked like liberty and felt like slow ruin. This man, call him Marcus, though his real name has vanished, was born in bondage. He swept floors, toiled in fields, fetched water, and endured every humiliation a master could devise. But he was clever and strong, and over years he found ways to squirrel away coins. A little earned from extra labor, a little more from selling scraps, sometimes a tiny gift from a sympathetic mistress. He learned to dream. Every night he counted his savings, measured the distance between slavery and freedom in battered copper coins. At last, after years of toil, he had enough to buy his freedom. He knelt before his master, offered the sum, and, by law and custom, was set free. The city recognized him as a freedman, with all the rights and duties that status entailed. For a moment, the world seemed full of possibility, but freedom in Rome, or Athens, or any ancient metropolis came with fine print. To gain his release, Marcus had to agree to a contract. Years of debt payments owed to the master or the city, sometimes with high interest, often enforced with the threat of renewed servitude. As a slave, Marcus had known his place. As a freedman, he was expected to pay for his liberty, and to pay fast. The city teemed with competition. Established citizens guarded the best jobs. Many trades were closed to freedmen, and the stigma of slavery still clung to him like a stain he could not wash away. He sought work, but everywhere he turned, doors closed. Guilds demanded bribes or birthright. Wealthy patrons who once praised his loyalty now turned cold. No longer responsible for his care, they moved on to newer, younger slaves. Desperate, Marcus borrowed from lenders, promising to pay once his fortunes changed. But the city had little patience for those who faltered. Debts mounted. The few coins he made vanished in a blink, spent on food, shelter, or snatched by creditors with iron-hard fists. The dream of freedom faded into a daily struggle for survival. Soon, Marcus faced a choice: default on his debts and risk prison, or sign himself over as an indentured laborer, working for a pittance under conditions nearly as harsh as slavery. Many freedmen fell into this trap, forced to labor on distant estates, chained not by law but by contracts and hunger. Some tried to flee, only to be hunted down and brought back in disgrace. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by the alleys and shadows, lost to history. Freedom was supposed to be a rebirth, but for Marcus, it became a slow descent into despair. The world was less forgiving than the dream had promised. Old friends in the slave quarters pitied him. Freeborn men despised him. He was caught in a limbo, neither property nor citizen, owing everything and possessing nothing. His story was not unique. Throughout the ancient world, thousands of freed slaves walked this path. Their names seldom entered the records, their struggles left out of grand histories written by the wealthy and the powerful. But their quiet tragedy changed the world all the same. Over generations, these stories of hardship and disappointment crept into the laws. Reforms came slowly, with new protections for freedmen, new rules about debt, and, eventually, the faintest hope of real opportunity. But for Marcus, it came too late. His life stands as a ghostly warning that freedom, when yoked to impossible debt, can become another form of bondage. His dreams, his hope, his brief moment of liberty, all were consumed not by cruelty, but by the cold logic of money and the city's indifference. So when we celebrate stories of liberation, remember the cost. For every triumphant escape, there are countless silent tales like Marcus's, of men and women who clawed their way out, only to find themselves trapped anew by the invisible chains of poverty, debt, and society's unyielding rules. Their pain and perseverance shaped the world, and their memory lingers in every freedom we take for granted. The builder who promised a temple and couldn't finish it. In the ancient world, to build was to promise immortality. Every stone set in a temple's foundation, every column rising against the sky, was a declaration of faith in the future and a claim on memory itself. For a city, a new temple was more than a building. It was the heart of the community, a beacon for pilgrims, a symbol of the gods' favor and the city's wealth. For the man who took on such a commission, whether a magistrate, architect, or ambitious contractor, the stakes were unimaginably high. Success meant honor, lasting gratitude, even the hope of a statue or a street named after you. But failure. Failure was a public execution of reputation. To promise a temple and not finish it was political suicide, a humiliation that could erase a lifetime of achievement in a matter of months. Across the Mediterranean, this story repeated itself. The city would announce a new project, a dazzling temple to Jupiter, Athena, or Isis. Funds would be raised, sometimes through public subscriptions, sometimes by draining the treasury. Plans were drawn, and the builder, carefully chosen for his skills and connections, stood before the people and the gods, swearing to deliver greatness. The pressure was enormous. For in this era, the line between public works and public spectacle was thin. Construction was watched, criticized, and gossiped about. The daily progress was everyone's business. Local poets wrote verses praising the first stones. Rival politicians whispered rumors about missing funds or shoddy materials. One such story comes from Roman times. A man entrusted with building a temple, whose name, now faded in official records, was once shouted in both admiration and, later, contempt. At first, he was celebrated, seen as the city's benefactor, showered with honors at public festivals. But as the months dragged on, problems began to mount. Stones failed to arrive from distant quarries. Funds, perhaps mishandled or siphoned off, began to dwindle. The project fell behind. What began as whispers grew into a storm of angry questions. Where was the builder's promised marvel? Why did the scaffolding rot in the rain, while rival cities dedicated new shrines and boasted of their prosperity? The city council, feeling the sting of public shame, demanded answers. But the builder's explanations, supply delays, unexpected floods, a shortage of skilled workers, meant nothing to a population hungry for results. The unfinished temple became a symbol of broken faith. It was said that the gods themselves withdrew their favor, that bad omens clustered over the city. Political enemies seized the moment. They painted the builder as a thief, a liar, even a blasphemer. In a culture where honor was currency, the humiliation was devastating. The punishments were swift and severe. Fines were levied, so massive they could wipe out a family's fortune in a single decree. In some cases, property was seized, homes auctioned to pay for missing stones or labor. But perhaps the cruelest fate was exile, a sentence not just to leave the city, but to wander, disgraced, in a world where every town square remembered your name for the wrong reasons. For the ruined builder, exile was both a physical and a spiritual death. In the lands beyond the city's gates, he became a cautionary tale, an object lesson told to every aspiring official. Better to promise nothing than to promise a temple and fail. Historians have uncovered traces of these tragedies in ancient inscriptions, where the names of failed builders are sometimes chipped away, erased by chisel, as if to remove them from memory itself. In other places, graffiti survives, angry curses scratched into stone by citizens furious that their offerings and taxes produced only a monument to incompetence. The ancient world did not easily forgive a broken promise, especially when it came dressed as piety and ambition. Yet, the story is more than a warning. It's a glimpse into the relentless pressures of public life, the impossibility of satisfying both the gods and the mob. Every unfinished temple stands as a silent monument, not just to failure, but to the unending hunger for glory that could destroy as easily as it could create. The builder who could not finish was not always a villain, but in the eyes of his city, he became something worse, a ghost of disappointment. A reminder that even the best intentions can be crushed by fate, by envy, or by forces beyond human control. So remember, every grand ruin hides the story of a promise made and broken, of a life destroyed by the weight of expectation, and a name once shouted in joy, now spoken only as a warning. In the ancient world, the cost of unfinished dreams was not measured in gold alone, but in shame, exile, and oblivion. The landlord who lost his tenants to a plague. In the dense, tangled heart of a medieval city, where narrow alleys vanished into darkness and church bells tolled warnings above crowded rooftops, there lived a landlord named Ulrich. His fortune was built not on royal favor or battlefield glory, but on the steady pulse of city life. Brick tenements that housed craftsmen, merchants, widows, and wanderers. In quieter times, Ulrich was considered lucky. Rents came due each month, the tap rooms beneath his apartments stayed busy, and the flow of gold coins through his hands promised security no field or trade could match. Yet beneath this apparent stability, Ulrich's world balanced on a fragile edge. The prosperity of the many supported the comfort of the few, and every brick depended on the bodies that filled the rooms. But the year the plague arrived, the city itself seemed to betray its people. It began with rumors, a fever that burned through distant villages, a cough that left the strong gasping, a darkness behind the eyes that foretold death. At first, Ulrich dismissed the tales. He collected his rents, ignoring the anxious questions from tenants and the tightening grip of fear in the market squares. But soon the city's gates were sealed, and the silent dread crept into every home. The tolling bell for the dead became relentless, and Ulrich watched with horror as his tenants vanished, carried away on carts or locked behind doors that no one dared open. Within weeks, entire floors of his buildings stood empty. Rooms once filled with laughter and quarrels now echoed with silence. Windows gaped like hollow eyes above streets scattered with straw and abandoned possessions. The few who remained begged for leniency, offering what little they could. But Ulrich's own fate was chained to theirs. For in those days, a landlord's obligations ran deep. Taxes on property and income, set by the city council and lords, did not vanish when tenants did. The city demanded payment as if nothing had changed, and Ulrich found himself squeezed by invisible hands. No rent, yet endless dues. He tried to plead his case before the magistrates, but the courts had become a place of panic and disease, their benches nearly deserted. The city's rulers, desperate to fund quarantine walls and armed patrols, had no sympathy for a landlord's suffering. So Ulrich pawned his few valuables, borrowed from those who still had faith, and watched as his fortunes withered away. The buildings that had once been his pride became burdens. The paint flaked from the doors, thieves stripped the empty rooms, and rats claimed the corners. Even when the plague's grip finally loosened, Ulrich's world was changed beyond recognition. The debts he owed could not be paid. Creditors circled, eager to claim what little remained. The city auctioned his properties to recoup taxes, ignoring Ulrich's pleas that a disaster had left him destitute through no fault of his own. In the eyes of the law, the contract between landlord and state was unbreakable. The loss of tenants, even to plague, was not an excuse, only a tragic misfortune that proved how easily fortune could twist to ruin. Ulrich's fall was not unique. Across Europe and Asia, waves of plague shattered not only families, but entire systems of wealth and power. Landlords who had once seemed unassailable found themselves ruined, undone by the relentless mathematics of empty rooms and unpaid dues. Even the great houses of Venice and London, Paris and Constantinople discovered that stone and title meant nothing when the lifeblood of tenants disappeared. For every noble or merchant who thrived in the chaos, buying up ruined estates at a fraction of their value, there were 100 Ulrichs forced into poverty and forgotten in the ledgers of history. This story reveals the truth that behind every great city, behind every gleaming wall or busy market, lay the quiet suffering of those whose fortunes depended on the simple act of people living together. When the plague came, it did not only kill, it unmade the fragile web of trust, labor, and hope that allowed cities to exist at all. And so, the name of Ulrich, landlord of forgotten tenements, lingers in the shadows of empty streets. A cautionary tale that wealth built on others' survival is always hostage to forces beyond our control, and that sometimes all it takes to fall from comfort into ruin is the silence that follows a single untimely bell. The sailor who bought his own ship and lost it on day one. In the bustling port city, where salt hung thick in the air and the cries of traders mingled with the screech of gulls, dreams were as common as waves and just as easily dashed. Among the hardened faces who earned their living at sea, there was one sailor whose ambition burned brighter than the lanterns on the docks. For years he had watched others command their own ships, captains whose word was law, whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides. He counted every coin he earned, hoarding wages, mending sails long into the night, and dreaming of the day he might no longer answer to another man's bell. At last, that day arrived, though not as he had pictured it. It was not a stately galleon or sleek merchantman that caught his eye, but a modest vessel, weathered yet sturdy, moored at the edge of the harbor. The ship was nothing special. Patches on her hull, her name faded by years of sun and spray. But to the sailor, she was freedom itself. With trembling hands, he signed the papers, agreeing to a price he could barely afford, much of it owed on credit to a merchant who saw the hunger in his eyes. For the first time, the sailor stood at the helm as owner, feeling the deck vibrate beneath his feet. Every plank and rope now his responsibility. News of his purchase swept the harbor. Friends toasted him in dockside taverns, slapping his back, whispering that fortune finally favored the patient and bold. He walked the pier with new authority, overseeing the loading of modest cargo, nothing grand, just enough to begin repaying his debt and stake his claim among the city's fleet. That night, as he lay in his tiny captain's cabin, he imagined a future of prosperity. His name known in every port, the debts paid off, the ship's hold full of riches from distant lands. But fate, in the ancient world, was a force to be both courted and feared. The sky grew dark, a brooding weight pressing down on the harbor. Sailors are attuned to the moods of the weather, but no one predicted what was coming, a storm as sudden as it was vicious. In minutes, the tranquil bay erupted. Winds howled down from the mountains, whipping the waves to a frenzy. The new captain rushed to secure his ship, shouting orders to a half-assembled crew, his hands raw on the rain-slick ropes. Lightning split the sky, illuminating chaos. Vessels tossed against the piers, mooring lines snapping like bowstrings, the harbor churning with debris. He fought with all the desperation of a man whose future was on the line, but nature was merciless. A rogue wave lifted the ship, slamming her down against a jagged stone outcropping hidden below the surface. The hull splintered, water surged in, and within moments the vessel, his vessel, listed violently, then began to sink, swallowed by the black waters as thunder shook the night. By dawn, only broken timbers floated in the foam, and the sailor stood alone on the quay, soaked and shivering, clutching the deed to a ship that no longer existed. Word spread quickly. The new captain, the sailor who had dared to dream of independence, had lost everything before his first voyage. The debt, merciless and immediate, was now his to bear with no means to pay it. The merchant who had advanced him credit demanded restitution. The harbor authorities offered little sympathy. Friends who had cheered him yesterday now avoided his gaze, as if bad luck might be contagious. Without a ship, the sailor could not work. Without work, the debt became a noose, tightening with every passing day. He wandered the docks, searching for odd jobs, haunted by the memory of his short-lived triumph. Other sailors offered pity, but no one dared risk a place on their crew for a man marked by such swift and spectacular misfortune. In the ancient world, fortune was fickle, and ruin always just a breath away. The sailor's story became a cautionary tale told in taverns and beside smoky fires, a reminder that even the bravest leap can land on shifting sand, that independence and disaster sometimes walk hand in hand. In time, the sailor faded into the faceless tide of laborers, his dreams drowned with the ship he lost on day one. The harbor moved on, the waves erased the wreck, but the lesson endured. The sea rewards few, and for every captain crowned in glory, there is another who loses everything in a single night. The orator who was fined for insulting a governor. Beneath the pillars of Rome's grandest forums, words were sharper than blades. The orators, masters of rhetoric, actors in the theater of the people, wielded language with precision, their voices able to sway crowds, win cases, or destroy reputations. But in the shadows of power, the line between truth and slander was perilously thin, and one careless phrase could cost you everything. So unfolds the story of Quintus Fabius, a brilliant orator who, with a single insult, lost the world he'd built with his tongue. Rome revered its orators. These men were not merely speakers, they were stars, celebrities, legal warriors who championed the weak or shamed the corrupt. Their reputations depended on courage, wit, and the willingness to court danger in the public eye. Quintus Fabius rose from obscurity, famed for his cutting wit and fearless attacks on the mighty. He fought for justice, exposed scandals, and became the voice of those silenced by fear. But in Rome, every victory created new enemies. One of them was Gaius Lucullus, a provincial governor notorious for greed and cruelty. Gaius Lucullus, cloaked in luxury, ruled his province like a private kingdom. His crimes were whispered in the streets: embezzlement, bribery, the selling of justice to the highest bidder. But few dared speak against him, until Quintus, with his golden voice and burning outrage, shattered the silence in the Senate. The words echoed off marble. Lucullus is a snake in silk, venomous, hidden, and dangerous. The phrase drew laughter, then gasps. The governor's eyes narrowed. The insult, public and unforgettable, would not be forgiven. In ancient Rome, slander was not a trivial matter. The law protected a man's reputation as fiercely as his property. Any attack on the honor of a magistrate or governor, especially in public, could be punished with ruinous fines, exile, or worse. Quintus believed the truth would shield him. He was wrong. Lucullus struck back with the full weight of the law. He brought charges for slander, or iniuria, demanding punishment for the insult. The trial gripped the city. Orators lined up on both sides. The Senate buzzed with debate. Some cheered Quintus's bravery, but others feared the precedent. If orators could not speak freely, who would challenge the powerful? But the governor had friends among the judges. The verdict was swift. Quintus was fined a sum so enormous he could never repay. His estate was seized. His home, his library, even his ancestral lands, all confiscated to satisfy the insult. Overnight, he went from hero to pauper. Homeless, disgraced, Quintus wandered the city he'd once commanded. Friends vanished. Clients deserted him. He became a ghost, his name a warning. In Rome, the powerful always have the last word. The people murmured about injustice, but no one dared speak out. The forum, once alive with his voice, fell silent where he had stood. Yet his words did not die. A snake in silk. The insult became legend, whispered in dark corners whenever corruption reared its head. Quintus's fate was retold for generations, a symbol of the risks faced by those who speak truth to power. his courage inspired others, even as his ruin chilled the bravest hearts. In the centuries that followed, the orators of Rome learned caution. They masked their attacks in riddles and irony, learning to navigate the razor's edge of the law. But the price of honesty was forever branded in memory. To insult the powerful was to risk everything, from wealth to life itself. The balance between justice and survival depended not just on words, but on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Rome thrived on speech, but the fate of Quintus Fabius revealed its cost. The echoes of his downfall still linger wherever words dare to challenge the shield of power. His story asks, what is the price of calling a snake by its name when the snake wears silk and rules the world? The perfumer who couldn't afford imported oils after a ban. In the narrow alleys of an ancient city, long before the world had words like globalization or trade war, there was a scent that lingered, a whisper of vanished luxury and ambition. Here, among faded murals and bustling market cries, stood the workshop of a master perfumer whose fortunes were built on a single fragile link: the caravans that brought precious oils from Egypt, across deserts and through ports, to the eager hands of Rome, Athens, or Byzantium. For years, his was a name synonymous with desire. Women and men alike queued for vials of scented oil, for the promise of a life touched by distant sun and exotic flowers. He had risen from apprentice to master, learning the art of blending myrrh, rose, and cinnamon with skillful hands and an alchemist's patience. But his true magic, the secret ingredient in every vial, was the finest oil of Egypt, a substance both costly and rare. It arrived in delicate jars, protected by wax and prayer, passed along guarded routes that tied continents together in invisible knots of commerce. His reputation soared. The nobility sought his perfumes for ceremonies, lovers traded his oils as tokens, and priests used his blends to sanctify temples and tombs. But beneath this prosperity lurked a danger that the perfumer could neither smell nor see: the shadow of politics, the invisible hand of state that could crush centuries of tradition overnight. One year, driven by disputes over grain, gold, or distant battles, the rulers imposed a ban, a sudden, unyielding blockade on all trade with Egypt. Caravans were stopped, ships seized, the ports watched by soldiers whose only loyalty was to the law. What seemed unthinkable became real. The city's markets were flooded not with fragrance, but with rumors and fear. For the perfumer, each day became a descent into panic. At first, he tried to stretch his dwindling reserves, watering the oils, blending with local substitutes, hoping no one would notice the slight dulling of the scent. But his customers did notice. Whispers spread. The perfume was weaker, the magic gone. Loyal patrons drifted away, seeking alternatives or hoarding the last drops of their favorite blends. The nobles grew cold. The priests stopped their orders. Even old friends became competitors, desperate for any source of the vanished oils. He tried everything. He sent messengers to smugglers, offered bribes to officials, risked arrest and ruin for a single amphora of Egyptian oil. But the ban was total. Prices soared beyond his means. Rivals with deeper pockets cornered the black market, selling adulterated oil at extortionate rates. The perfumer's savings evaporated. His apprentices left, lured away by promises or driven by hunger. The once lively workshop fell silent, the scent of failure hanging thicker than any perfume he ever made. The city changed too. The absence of fragrance altered everything: the rituals of love, the ceremonies of mourning, even the rhythm of daily bathing. Scent, once a marker of identity and civilization, became a memory. Shops closed their doors, shutters banged in the wind, and the air itself seemed barren. For those who had once thrived on imported luxury, there was no rescue. The perfumer pawned his tools, sold his last stock at a loss, and watched the world move on without him. Some say he wandered the markets long after, a ghost haunting the stalls, pressing faded vials into the hands of strangers and begging them to remember a time when the city itself seemed touched by the warmth of distant sun. Others say he disappeared, lost in the crowd of those ruined by the whim of kings and the invisible borders drawn for reasons no merchant could understand. His story is not just about business or beauty, it is about fragility, about how a single law, passed in a distant chamber, can unravel lives bound together by the scent of possibility. We like to believe that genius and hard work are enough, but history is written in bans and embargoes, in the sudden end of the world as someone knew it. The perfumer's fate is echoed every time politics closes a border, every time an artist loses their medium, every time a community finds that the heart of its ritual has vanished. His is the silent tragedy behind every empty shop, every lost art, every scent that lingers in memory but cannot be recreated. So when you breathe in a rare perfume, remember, somewhere, a perfumer risked everything for the chance to make the air beautiful. And sometimes, the world changed, and nothing, no skill, no love, no prayer, could bring the scent of hope back. The baker who underweighed loaves and was shut down. In every great city, bread was more than food. It was survival itself, a daily symbol of justice, order, and hope. When times were good, the scent of fresh loaves drifted through winding streets, drawing crowds to the baker's door. But in the shadow of famine, when every crumb was counted, that same aroma could ignite rage. Among all the trades, the baker stood closest to the fragile line between hunger and plenty. And in that pressure, temptation could turn deadly. For one baker, a single act, selling underweight loaves when the city starved, became the spark for ruin, disgrace, and the fury of a betrayed mob. The rules were strict. In medieval and early modern cities, the weight of every loaf was not a matter of opinion, but of law. Officials checked the scales, and bakers caught cheating could be fined, shamed, or worse. During famine, these rules grew sharper. Short measures meant stolen life. A baker was sworn not just to profit, but to fairness. The public trusted him with their children's hunger. When that trust snapped, the city snapped back. In the archives of London, Paris, and Florence, there are stories, sometimes anonymous, sometimes named, of bakers who risked everything for a handful of coins. Some did so out of desperation, their own cupboards bare. Others, driven by greed, hoped to grow rich, while others withered. But the city watched. Weighers and market wardens made surprise visits. Neighbors whispered. Word spread faster than fire. The punishment was as much theater as justice. In a time before newsprint and broadcast, public spectacle taught the lesson. The baker was hauled before the magistrate, his face gray with dread. Neighbors gathered, silent at first, then muttering. The sentence was not only a fine, but public humiliation. His license revoked, his right to work stripped away in front of all who depended on him. The ovens, those glowing heartbeats of the neighborhood, were smashed with hammers and axes as the crowd watched, cheering or cursing. The city meant to make an example. To lose your oven was to lose your livelihood, your place in the world. Bakers were not simply vendors, they were fixtures in every street, witnesses to birth, death, and daily struggle. Now, the fallen baker stood outside his shattered shop, possessions tossed in the gutter, the laughter of the crowd echoing in his ears. Some tried to plead their case, blaming the miller, the weather, the tax collector. But in famine, sympathy was rare. To cheat the scales was to cheat the whole city. In some cases, bakers were forced to parade through the market with their lightest loaves hung around their necks, a living warning of what dishonesty would earn. Yet behind every public disaster was a private ruin. The baker's family, once respected, now found themselves outcasts. Customers vanished. Friends fell silent. Children hid from jeers. Sometimes the baker disappeared, fleeing the city, seeking work in distant villages where his shame was unknown. Other times he remained, haunted by what he had done and what had been done to him. But why such ferocity? Because bread was sacred. It was the staple that stood between order and chaos. In the tight, anxious world of a hungry city, trust in the baker was trust in tomorrow itself. When that was broken, the wound bled into every home. The lesson was brutal but clear. Justice for the hungry demanded more than apologies. It demanded a reckoning as loud as the crime. So remember, every loaf carries more than grain. It holds the history of hunger and hope, of trust and temptation, of the high cost of betrayal. The ovens smashed in the street are gone now, but their story lingers. In the rules that protect the vulnerable, and in the warning that echoes, betray the trust of the hungry, and you will answer not just to the law, but to the very crowd you once fed. The architect who invested in marble and was robbed by pirates. In the roaring heart of the Renaissance, when cathedrals reached for the heavens and the very skyline of Italy shimmered with ambition, there was an architect named Matteo. Born to a lineage of masons, Matteo had dreams not just of building, but of creating monuments that would outlive memory itself. His vision demanded the finest materials, and in that age, nothing surpassed the luminous allure of Carrara marble, white as moonlight, veined like frozen rivers, coveted by princes and popes alike. Securing it, however, was an act of daring, risk, and relentless hope. For the finest quarries stood far from the cities they would adorn, and the sea between them was haunted by shadows. Matteo poured his fortune into a shipment of marble blocks, more than he could truly afford. This was not simply business. It was a gamble with fate, the kind that had made and ruined men for centuries. He oversaw the loading of each slab, their surfaces cool and smooth, destined for the facade of a grand basilica. Every coin was borrowed, every promise staked on the safe arrival of that shining stone. He watched the merchant ship set sail from the Tuscan port, sails billowing as prayers were whispered into the wind. But beyond the coastline, where the land faded into blue, waited dangers no artist could tame. The Mediterranean was a crossroads of ambition and desperation. Its waters ruled not by kings, but by pirates. These corsairs, driven by hunger, greed, and the unending chaos of fractured kingdoms, scoured the shipping lanes. They knew the worth of marble and the dreams it fueled. As Matteo's ship approached the Narrows, sails appeared on the horizon. Pirate vessels, swift and silent, driven by years of practice and the scent of easy prey. The confrontation was swift and merciless. Armed men boarded the merchant ship, overpowering the crew. The marble, too heavy to steal away piece by piece, was claimed as ransom for the ship itself. Some blocks were thrown overboard to lighten the load. Others marked with the pirates' insignia, proof to distant buyers that the precious cargo was no longer safe. Matteo learned of his disaster, not from the mouths of survivors, but from the silence that followed. No letters, no payments, only rumors in the taverns, and the cold confirmation from trembling merchants who had seen the pirate banners. The loss was absolute. Matteo's creditors descended with the force of law and desperation. The money he had borrowed to secure the marble was due, with interest, and there was nothing left to offer as collateral. He pleaded for time, explaining the piracy, but the rules of commerce were unyielding. A contract was a contract. Misfortune, even at sea, was his burden to bear. The courts favored the lenders, and Matteo's assets, his modest house, his studio, even unfinished sketches, were seized. The unfinished basilica stood as a cruel monument to his ruined ambition, its empty niches awaiting marble that would never come. Matteo's fate was repeated across the centuries by those who dared to trade by sea. The movement of high-value goods, whether marble, silk, or spices, was always a dance with danger. Piracy was not a romantic notion, but a daily terror. Insurance, in its earliest form, was rare and expensive, and even the richest patrons might refuse to cover a craftsman's losses. One moment of violence could erase years of effort and trust. The artist, whose vision should have been his protection, found himself destroyed by forces he could not control. Yet the story did not end only in despair. The ruins of Matteo's dreams haunted the city, a visible lesson in the perils of ambition. Patrons and builders became more cautious. Shipping alliances grew, merchants hired armed escorts, and the first joint stock companies were born, spreading risk so that no single man's fall would destroy an entire vision. But for Matteo, as for so many, the price of beauty was paid in loneliness and loss. The city's marble shone on in other buildings, but his name was spoken in hushed tones, a warning that greatness balanced always on the edge of catastrophe, and that the world's finest dreams are sometimes stolen by the tides, claimed by pirates who leave nothing behind but silence and the memory of what might have been. The widow who inherited debt instead of wealth. In the quiet aftermath of a funeral, when the last prayers have faded and the mourners have drifted away, a widow's world is supposed to be sheltered by the promises left behind. In the ancient world, those promises often took the form of land, livestock, or a home, signs of security and respect earned through years of toil. But for many women, the death of a husband marked not the start of safety, but the opening of a trap set by the laws of men and the weight of custom. The story of the widow who inherited debt instead of wealth is one of sorrow and injustice, yet it is a tale told across generations, a shadow beneath the rituals of inheritance and legacy. She had expected, as custom dictated, that her husband's land would pass to her. For years she had worked beside him, tending the fields, keeping the accounts, sharing in every sacrifice. His will, though brief, seemed clear enough. The farm, the house, and what little remained in the coffers were to go to his beloved wife. The day after the burial, she dressed in mourning and prepared to receive the neighbors, expecting condolences and perhaps a helping hand. Instead, she was greeted by creditors, stern men in worn cloaks, clutching ledgers and contracts. With measured voices, they recited her late husband's obligations, the grain loans, the debts for seed and tools, the unpaid taxes. One by one, the debts were tallied, each sum larger than the last. She listened in disbelief, the words swimming before her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. "It is the law," they said. "What was his is now yours. You inherit all, not just the land, but what is owed upon it." She protested, but tradition and statute were against her. In the eyes of the court, the estate was not a sanctuary, but a ledger, and every balance had to be settled before a single coin could pass to her name. As days turned into weeks, the widow found herself caught in an unending storm of demands. The farm was assessed and valued, not for her comfort, but for how quickly it could be liquidated to pay the debts. Tools and livestock vanished one by one, sold at auction to satisfy impatient lenders. Even the family home, where generations had been born and died, stood under threat, its fate to be decided not by her will, but by the numbers on a parchment held by strangers. The community, for all its whispered sympathy, did little. Few dared to intervene. After all, anyone could be next. In her struggle, The widow appealed to every authority she could find: the elders of the village, the magistrate, even distant relatives. Some offered words of comfort, but the law was unyielding. Others eyed the farm for themselves, hoping to buy it cheaply once her resistance broke. Each day, the widow rose before dawn to work the land, hoping to earn enough to stave off disaster. But the debts grew faster than the crops. Hunger crept in, and with it, a sense of isolation. Former friends avoided her gaze in the marketplace, fearing the taint of her misfortune. Her children, once secure, now faced an uncertain future, their inheritance reduced to rumor and regret. The story spread through the town, serving as a warning as well as a lament. "Beware the hidden debts," people whispered, "for they lie buried beneath every promise." For the widow, every visit from a creditor was a fresh wound, a reminder that the world measured her worth not in loyalty or labor, but in the ability to pay what another had owed. Over time, the land was lost, her home passed into other hands, and the widow was left to seek shelter with distant kin, her life's work erased by the ink of a contract she had never seen. Yet her story lived on, retold in quiet corners and at firesides. It became a symbol of how inheritance can be a double-edged sword, especially for those whose rights are only as strong as the mercy of law and custom. In her struggle, generations of women saw their own reflection: the hope of legacy, the heartbreak of loss, the fight for dignity against a system built to favor others. Even centuries later, her tale is a reminder: behind every promise of wealth, there may lurk a shadow, and justice is often no more than a whisper on the wind. The landowner who backed a political campaign and was exiled. In the intricate maze of Roman politics, alliances were currency, and ambition ran deeper than blood. Power in the city did not belong only to senators or generals. It also lived in the hands of wealthy landowners whose estates stretched across the countryside, their fortunes built on wheat, wine, and careful calculation. Among them was Lucius Petronius, a man who understood that influence was rarely won in the forum alone. To secure his family's future, he placed his faith and his fortune in the hands of a rising political star, never knowing that his gamble would end not in triumph, but in exile. Petronius was no stranger to the game. The Republic thrived on favors, debts, and the constant trade of loyalty. Men like him hosted lavish feasts, sponsored public games, and bankrolled the campaigns of young patricians eager for power. The reward, if the gamble succeeded, was immense: friends in high places, lucrative contracts, the protection of laws written with your interests in mind. But failure carried a price more ruinous than any battlefield defeat. In the spring of his greatest risk, Petronius found his champion in Marcus Sergius, a young politician with golden rhetoric and the promise of reform. Rome, hungry for change, buzzed with Sergius's speeches. Petronius saw an opportunity. If he could carry Sergius into office, his own influence would eclipse that of his rivals. So he poured money into the campaign: gold for bribes, food for the crowds, lavish gifts for crucial votes. His estates produced less each year, but Petronius borrowed heavily, certain the investment would soon pay dividends. But politics in Rome was a tempest. Rivals whispered scandals, storms of rumor battered Sergius's reputation, and old enemies struck with cunning precision. When election day arrived, the victory Petronius hoped for never came. Sergius lost by a razor's edge, undone by whispers, and the fortune Petronius had invested became a millstone. Debts came due. The creditors, once silent, now demanded their gold. The men who had eaten his bread and drunk his wine turned away, denying ever having received favors. Rome's memory was short, her gratitude even shorter. Petronius scrambled to sell land, but the market was ruthless. Prices plummeted as word spread of his financial trouble. Even his oldest friends distanced themselves, afraid his misfortune would taint their own fortunes. The Senate looked the other way. After all, who weeps for a gambler who lost? The courts were swift. Unable to pay his debts, Petronius was stripped of property. His name dragged through public records as an example to others. In Rome, debt was not just a financial misstep. It was a moral stain, a sign of weakness unworthy of the Republic's ideals. When the final notice came, exile was the only option. It was not merely a punishment, but a social death. Forced to leave Rome behind, Petronius crossed the sea to a distant province, trading marble villas for a rented room in an unfamiliar city. His family, once the envy of neighbors, now survived on what little he could carry. The corridors of power were closed to him forever. His estates, his titles, his influence, all vanished like the promises of the campaign he'd once believed in. But in the taverns and marketplaces, his story lingered. He became a cautionary tale. The landowner who wagered everything on politics and paid the price in shame and solitude. Yet beneath the warnings, there was a quiet admiration for his boldness, a reminder that the engine of Rome was driven by risk, by the men who dared to bet everything on a single roll of the political dice. For every Petronius, dozens more hovered at the edge, tempted by the same hope, haunted by the same fear. Rome offered no guarantees, and the men who shaped her fate knew that today's triumph could become tomorrow's ruin with a single shift in the city's restless winds. In the end, Petronius's exile was more than a punishment. It was a lesson written into the soul of every citizen. In the eternal city, to back the wrong cause was to lose not just your fortune, but your very place in the world. The tavern owner who lost his license. After a brawl, there's a certain glow to the taverns of history, places where laughter, stories, and secrets soaked into wood and stone. For one owner, the tavern was more than a livelihood. It was an island of belonging, a fortress against the hardships of medieval life. By day, it bustled with merchants trading news over cider. By night, it was a roaring sea of song, soldiers, and dice, alive with every shade of hope and risk. But in a single night, when swords were drawn and blood spilled among drunken soldiers, that fragile world shattered, leaving the tavern keeper stripped of everything he had built. The owner had started small, inheriting a dusty alehouse from a distant uncle. With sweat and shrewdness, he transformed it into the town's heart. He knew every regular's favorite drink, could settle disputes with a wink, and kept the local officials close with carefully poured bribes and generous cups. The tavern became a crossroads for travelers and townsfolk, a place where barriers of class and clan melted away. Profits swelled, and so did the owner's pride. His children were schooled, his debts paid, and his name carried respect that money could never buy. But prosperity in a world run by fragile rules can be a dangerous illusion. In cities across medieval Europe, tavern licenses were both a privilege and a weapon. At the first sign of disorder, they could be revoked with the stroke of a magistrate's pen. No warning, no appeal, no justice. The owner's rivals, jealous of his success, whispered to the authorities about his rowdy crowds, hinting at seditious talk and secret dealings. Yet for years, he managed to avoid disaster, diffusing fights before they could ignite and throwing troublemakers out into the night. Then, one fateful night, a regiment of soldiers marched in, already heavy with wine and grievances. Tensions boiled between rival factions, old insults resurfaced, dice were thrown, and soon words became fists. Swords flashed. A bench was smashed. A torch fell. Chaos erupted. The owner plunged into the melee, desperate to restore order, but the soldier's anger drowned out his voice. By dawn, the tavern was a ruin. Tables shattered, blood on the flagstones, a city watchman injured in the brawl. Within hours, rumors twisted the truth. Officials, eager for a scapegoat and pressured by powerful military commanders, acted swiftly. The tavern's license was revoked. The doors were sealed, property seized, and the owner summoned to face a tribunal. He pleaded his case, but the law cared little for nuance. In the records, he was marked as reckless, unfit to manage the peace, a danger to public order. The same men who once toasted him now turned away, unwilling to challenge authority or risk their own standing. Without his license, the owner's world collapsed. Creditors pounced, demanding payment for ale he could no longer sell. Friends became distant, frightened of association. His family, once secure, faced eviction and hunger. Forced from his home, the owner wandered the town in disgrace. His name became a cautionary tale, a warning whispered by every rival tavern. One night, one mistake, and all can be lost. But beneath the ruins of his tavern lay deeper lessons. His story was not unique. Throughout history, tavern owners lived at the mercy of law, gossip, and the unpredictable violence of those they served. Their fates hung on the fragile thread of reputation, one easily severed by accident, malice, or blind bureaucracy. The power to gather, to speak freely, to earn a living. These were never guaranteed. They could be revoked in a heartbeat, leaving only silence where once there was song. Even after his exile, some remembered the old tavern's warmth. In quiet corners, people missed the haven he'd built, a place of belonging lost to the cold calculations of authority. And so, with every empty stool, with every story untold, the spirit of the owner haunted the town. His rise and ruin are reminders that history's public places are often shaped, and sometimes shattered, by moments no one sees coming. And that behind every locked door, there is a story waiting to be remembered. The teacher who couldn't pay library fees. In the ancient world, knowledge was not free. Behind every lecture, every copied scroll, every student's question, there was a price. Sometimes literal, sometimes a matter of standing or survival. To teach was not only to shape young minds, but also to gamble with your own future. For the gatekeepers of wisdom were as merciless as any tax collector or rival guild. In cities like Alexandria, Athens, and Rome, the great libraries and scriptoria served as both sanctuaries and battlegrounds, where a teacher's reputation could rise or fall with the turn of a page. Among their rules, one was ironclad. To borrow a scroll or rent a classroom, you paid your dues. To falter even once was to risk everything. Imagine a teacher, an ordinary scholar, neither the greatest nor the least, trying to make his way among students hungry for more than bread. Each day, he entered the cool halls of the library, his fee paid in coins borrowed or scraped from last week's lessons. The right to use the scrolls was not a gift. It was a privilege, guarded by sharp-eyed clerks who tracked every name, every borrowed line, every minute spent in rented corners where teachers met students. The library was a living ledger, silent, watchful, unforgiving. For many, the fees were a daily struggle, a sudden illness, a slow month, an ungrateful patron. Any setback could upset the delicate balance. The teacher who could not pay found doors shut and voices turned cold. Rumors spread quickly. Was he careless? A fraud? Or simply unlucky? In a world where public standing was everything, late fees became more than an embarrassment. They were a stain, a sign of weakness. Yet, for most educators, teaching was a calling, not a source of wealth. They lived at the edge, caught between the love of learning and the relentless demands of their creditors. One story, found in the faded letters of a Roman administrator, tells of a tutor who once drew crowds for his lectures. His students gathered eagerly, hanging on every word. But the scrolls he used, the lessons he shared, all came at a price. For months he scraped by, hoping for a wealthy sponsor or a generous parent to erase his debts. The help never came. One morning, the library clerk appeared at his door. The unpaid fees had piled up, interest growing like a shadow across his name. With a few curt words, his privileges were revoked. He was barred from the reading rooms, his rented classroom reassigned. Word spread to the city magistrates, who enforced the library's contract with the same severity as any business debt. In the blink of an eye, the teacher lost not just his classroom, but his legal status as an educator. In many ancient cities, the right to teach was a civic office, a formal role. Lose it, and you lost everything. Income, reputation, even citizenship in some cases. The students scattered. Some found new tutors. Others left their studies altogether. The teacher's name became a caution. In a world where knowledge was currency, to default was to be cast into darkness. But why such harshness? The libraries, too, were fragile institutions. Scrolls were precious, copied by hand, vulnerable to theft, damage, or loss. The spaces where ideas were exchanged were always in demand. To allow one debtor to escape payment threatened the whole system. The rules were strict, the penalties swift. The city believed it was defending knowledge itself, even if it meant sacrificing those who lived to teach it. So the teacher, once celebrated, now found himself on the outside, staring at the columns and steps where he once stood proud. Perhaps he begged a rival for mercy. Perhaps he left for another city, hoping to start anew. Some gave up teaching, broken by shame. Others fought on, living at the edge of society, still sharing wisdom in whispered tones beneath colonnades or in busy markets. Every scroll, every lesson, every classroom carries a cost, not just in coin, but in hope, risk, and pride. And so the story endures. In every age, knowledge demands its price, and those who teach must pay, one way or another. The artisan who paid for a stall that didn't exist. In the swirling chaos of the medieval marketplace, where barter, haggling, and shouts of promise filled the air, fortunes could rise or fall with the sun. For a struggling artisan named Leofric, the market was not just a place of commerce, but the fragile stage upon which his entire life depended. He was a carver of wood, bowls, spoons, and small idols, his skill inherited from generations before him. Each morning, Leofric dreamed of a permanent stall, a patch of cobblestones he could call his own, where regular customers would return and his reputation might finally take root. It was every artisan's ambition, but for most, a privilege nearly out of reach, reserved for those with money or powerful friends. One morning, as Leofric packed away his goods at the edge of the square, a man in fine cloak and city badge approached. He spoke with the authority of the Market Guild, offering Leofric the chance of a lifetime. A prime stall in the bustling center, guaranteed for a year. But the fee was high. The official's words dripped with reassurance. Papers stamped, signatures ready, all above board. Blinded by hope, Leofric rushed home, gathering every coin he'd ever saved, every favor owed, every trinket left from better times. To him, this was not just a transaction. It was the end of uncertainty, a doorway to respect and stability. The deal was swift. Money changed hands in a cramped office lit by flickering candlelight. Leofric was handed a document, stamped and sealed, its language ornate and nearly impossible to decipher. But the promise was clear. A stall of his own, beginning on the first market day of spring. That night, Leofric could barely sleep, his mind alive with dreams of steady income and security. He planned improvements, new tools, better woods. At last, after years of wandering and borrowed space, he would have a place to stand tall. When spring dawned, Leofric arrived early, arms full of wares and heart pounding with hope. But at the center of the square, where his stall was supposed to stand, he found nothing but empty flagstones. The market guildmaster, real this time, eyed his paper with suspicion and then pity. The badge on the man who'd sold him the stall was a forgery. The seal was a clever copy. Leofric had been swindled, caught by a scam so common yet so devastating, it destroyed not only his savings, but his spirit. There was no recourse, no way to recover the coins he'd scraped together with years of sacrifice. The man who took his money vanished into the crowded alleys, his scheme repeated on dozens more before anyone could act. Leofric's descent was rapid. With no stall and no funds to rent another, he was forced to the marketplace fringes, where only the most desperate and invisible artisans scraped by. His goods, once admired for their beauty, were overlooked among the noise. Customers hesitated, remembering the rumors. Scams bred suspicion, and every artisan suffered. Even friends distanced themselves, wary of misfortune and the stigma of being cheated. For Leofric, the dream of independence turned to daily humiliation. The market, once alive with possibility, became a cage from which he could not escape. This was not the story of one unlucky man, but of an era where fraud and official corruption thrived in the gaps between law and desperation. Medieval cities were riddled with scams. Fake charters, forged seals, and false promises preyed on the hope of the poor. Market rights and access were often bought with bribes, while real authorities sometimes looked away or even profited from the chaos. Those who fell victim rarely saw justice. The law favored the powerful, and thieves melted into the crowds, unpunished and free to strike again. The suffering of artisans like Leofric remained invisible, lost in the endless churn of city life. His tale survives as a warning, whispered by cautious parents and careful masters. Trust, but only with proof. Hope, but never blindly. And remember that even the most promising opportunity can conceal a trap. In the end, Leofric's story is not merely a tragedy, but a reflection of the precariousness that defined ordinary lives for centuries. A single cruel trick could shatter years of Hona. The senator's son who bought a chariot team and lost everything. In the fevered heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns cast long shadows and the roar of the crowd echoed from dawn till dusk, ambition could become a weapon as sharp as any blade. Few obsessions gripped the Roman elite like chariot racing, a spectacle of speed, glory, and fortune, where destinies were decided in the blink of an eye. For the sons of senators and nobles, the circus was not just entertainment. It was a battlefield of pride, an arena where the line between honor and ruin was paper thin. The story of the senator's son who bought a chariot team and lost everything is more than a tale of failed ambition. It is a warning, written in dust and blood, about the price of gambling with legacy itself. He was young, privileged, and hungry for acclaim. A name whispered in the palaces and forums, known as much for his daring as for the silver sigil on his tunic. His father, a pillar of the Senate, had warned him of the dangers that stalked the Circus Maximus. The gamblers, the cheats, the fortunes won and lost in a heartbeat. But the son, drawn to the thunder of hooves and the scent of power, would not be denied. In secret, he gathered his savings, sold heirlooms and jewelry, and at last invested in a chariot team of his own, a stable of swift horses and hardened drivers, each as desperate for victory as he was. His arrival at the races was announced with a fanfare. The senator's son, flush with youth and coin, bet not only on his team, but on his own skill as an amateur charioteer. A scandal and a spectacle in equal measure. The city gossiped. The crowds pressed closer. The bookmakers took bets. He donned the colors of his chosen faction, practiced day and night, and paid trainers and stable masters to hone his every move. In the weeks before the great contest, his confidence grew alongside the mountain of wagers placed in his name. But in Rome, luck was a fleeting ally. On the day of the race, the stands overflowed. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the wind, and the chariots lined up at the starting gate. The senator's son, flushed with anticipation, took the reins himself, determined to show the city his birthright was more than inherited power. The first lap went smoothly. His team surged ahead, the wheels of his chariot a blur. But at the sharpest turn, disaster struck. Whether by inexperience, a rival's dirty trick, or the treacherous mud thrown up by the horses ahead, the chariot veered wildly. It slammed into the barrier, splintering wood and tossing the young nobleman to the ground. In an instant, hopes and wagers alike shattered on the stones. The race moved on without him, but the consequences had only begun. The senator's son, bruised and humiliated, limped back to the stables, only to find his debts waiting, bets lost, repairs owed, trainers demanding payment for their failed promise. In the days that followed, creditors descended, each more impatient than the last. The winnings that might have paid the loans were gone. The family fortune, so carefully tended by his father, was now at risk. With nowhere to turn, the youth was forced to sell land, acre by acre, olive groves and vineyards that had belonged to his family for generations. Each plot lost was another wound to his father's legacy, another rumor whispered in the Senate halls. The senator, shamed before his peers, could do little but watch as the family estate was picked apart to settle his son's reckless wagers. Friends who had once sought invitations to their villa now avoided their company. The senator's son, once a fixture at every banquet and triumph, faded from public life, a living cautionary tale spoken of in hushed tones at the baths and markets. Chariot racing remained Rome's grandest obsession, but his name became a warning to all who would wager more than they could afford to lose. In the end, the story of the senator's son was told not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson in ruin. For every victor crowned in the Circus Maximus, there were dozens left broken, by pride, by luck, by the irresistible pull of the gamble. The family lands, once green and prosperous, were scattered to new owners, and the senator's line, though remembered in the Senate's rolls, was marked forever by the folly of a single reckless bet, the miner who was fined for a tunnel collapse. Beneath the surface of the Roman Empire, in tunnels choked with dust and darkness, another world existed, a world of miners, men who gambled their lives for silver, copper, and the empire's endless hunger for wealth. These were not the celebrated soldiers or gilded politicians of Rome. Their stories began and ended underground, their fates tied to the whim of stone and the cruelty of economics. Among them was Marcus Attilius, a miner whose name was destined to be erased, not by time, but by the law's merciless grip after a single day of disaster. Marcus was not born to privilege. His hands bore the scars of 1,000 cuts, his lungs heavy from years spent in air that never knew sunlight. For men like him, mining was survival, a livelihood as hazardous as it was necessary. The empire demanded metals for coins, weapons, aqueducts. Mines dotted the provinces, run by contractors who squeezed every ounce from men and earth alike. Marcus rose to the level of overseer, a rare honor, but one that brought only more risk. The lives of dozens depended on his judgment and luck. The mine was a living thing, unpredictable, always shifting, and never truly safe. Marcus learned to listen to its moods, to sense the subtle tremors before disaster struck. But on one fateful afternoon, greed and pressure from above forced him to take a gamble. The demand was urgent. A new tunnel, faster, deeper, more productive. Ignoring warnings, he pressed the men to keep digging, even as the ground trembled with warning. In a single, terrible instant, the world collapsed. The tunnel caved in, burying men alive, crushing tools, and destroying weeks of backbreaking labor. Panic spread, but for Marcus, the nightmare had only begun. Roman law was clear: mine collapses, especially those causing death and loss of imperial resources, were crimes of negligence or worse. Contractors and overseers were held responsible, often punished as examples to others. Investigators arrived swiftly, cold-eyed and unyielding. Survivors told of Marcus's orders, the ignored warnings. Grief mingled with accusation. Within days, the verdict was announced. Marcus was to be fined for every life lost, every coin of property destroyed. An impossible sum for a man who owned nothing but scars. The fines themselves were a sentence. Unable to pay, Marcus faced the only fate left for the destitute: the labor camp. Rome's empire was fueled by men who could not escape their debts. Prisoners sent to build roads, drain swamps, quarry stone, or return to the very mines where they first fell. Shackled and stripped of all dignity, Marcus joined a legion of the forgotten, laboring not for wages, but to pay an unpayable debt to an empire that valued gold above life. In the brutal routine of the camp, hope faded quickly. Food was meager, sleep broken by guards' shouts, sickness spread, and men vanished overnight. Marcus's family, left behind in poverty, could do nothing. His name, once spoken with pride among miners, became a warning. Defy the earth or the empire, and you'll lose everything. His story was retold in whispers, a lesson for every overseer forced to choose between orders from above and the fragile safety of those below. But the lesson ran deeper still. Rome's ambition was built on the backs of men like Marcus, whose sacrifices filled the treasury but emptied the soul. The law, meant to ensure safety and justice, became another weight, indifferent to circumstance, demanding payment even from the ruined. The empire's mines continued to churn, but Marcus's tale lingered in the shadows, a reminder that in Rome, risk was always personal, and the cost of failure could outlast life itself. Centuries passed, and the stones above those ancient tunnels crumbled. Yet for every monument Rome raised, the memory of the men it consumed could never truly be buried. The miner who was fined beyond recovery, sent away to repay an impossible debt, remains a silent echo in the dark, a testament to the price of ambition, the cruelty of law, and the fragility of those who toiled unseen beneath the empire's weight. The cloth merchant who couldn't compete with cheap imports. There was a time when the clatter of looms was the heartbeat of entire towns, when the dye-stained hands of weavers and merchants fed not only their own families, but a network of apprentices, spinners, and porters whose livelihoods depended on the steady trade in cloth. For generations, the local merchant's stall was a pillar of the market square, alive with color and the warm barter of trusted faces. But history does not favor the slow, nor does it reward the loyal when the rules change. The arrival of foreign traders, bearing fabric at a fraction of the price, would sweep away centuries of tradition and pride, leaving entire districts of weavers ruined, caught in a storm that none had seen coming. The merchant's life had always been a careful balancing act, bartering with dyers for the richest hues, haggling with shepherds for the finest wool, negotiating with guilds to keep prices fair and quality high. He had built his reputation on reliability. His customers knew that the cloth he sold would last a lifetime, that the colors would not fade, and that every purchase kept neighbors in work. But the world was changing. Ships from distant ports began to arrive with holds stuffed full of cheap, brightly colored fabrics made with methods and materials no local craftsman could match. At first, the merchant scoffed. Foreign cloth was thin, the colors garish. Surely customers would stay loyal to the goods their grandmothers had trusted. Yet, curiosity is a powerful force, and gold even more so. The imported fabrics were not just cheaper, they were dazzling, exotic, and new. Soon, the bustle at his stall thinned. Old friends began to buy their linens and silks elsewhere, ashamed to admit it, but unable to resist the savings. He tried everything to compete, slashing his own prices, working longer hours, pressuring his weavers for ever cheaper goods. The effort only deepened the crisis. His partners went unpaid, then left the trade altogether. Apprentices, sensing disaster, drifted away to other towns or other professions. Entire workshops fell silent. The merchant watched as once vibrant streets grew quiet, homes shuttered, and the communal pride that once held the district together dissolved into private despair. Desperation drove him to the city authorities, pleading for tariffs or bans on foreign cloth. But officials, eager for revenue, swayed by powerful trading companies, turned a deaf ear. Progress, they said, cannot be stopped. The suffering of weavers and spinners was the price of prosperity, a sacrifice to the gods of trade and novelty. The merchant's savings vanished. He sold off his stock at a loss, pawned his tools, and watched his competitors, the foreign traders, grow rich and arrogant in the very streets his ancestors had built. Once he had imagined passing the stall to his children, a legacy of honest work and communal pride. Now there was nothing left to inherit but debts and memories. The ruin was not his alone. Across the district, families starved, skills honed over generations were lost, and the identity of the town faded into a ghost of what it had been. Some took up new trades, others left in search of hope elsewhere. The merchant himself, once a respected figure, became a cautionary tale, a victim of forces larger than any individual, swept aside by a tide of change no one could control. His story is not unique. The rise and fall of local industry in the face of cheap imports has echoed through centuries and continents, from Silk Roads to industrial mills to the global markets of today. It is the quiet tragedy behind every bargain. The cost not just in gold, but in dignity, belonging, and the invisible bonds that hold communities together. So the next time you run your fingers across a piece of cloth, ask whose hands were silenced so that it could be made, whose dreams faded so that others could save a coin. For every merchant like him, there are thousands more, woven into the fabric of history, voices lost but not forgotten, in the rush of the world's endless marketplace, the doctor who was sued for a botched surgery. In the ancient and medieval worlds, to be a doctor was to walk a knife's edge between hope and catastrophe. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and little mercy when a healer's skill fell short. Surgery was a last resort, feared by patient and physician alike, yet demanded by the desperate. The law, as unforgiving as any wound, watched closely. For a surgeon who failed, whose patient bled out on a crude wooden table, whose stitches could not hold back the river of life, there waited not just guilt, but public ruin, financial disaster, and the jeering condemnation of an entire city. In Greece, Rome, and across the Islamic world, codes of medical ethics and liability were clear. The Hippocratic Oath was sacred, but laws were stricter still. A doctor was paid well for success, but if he failed, especially through negligence, ignorance, or overconfidence, he could be dragged into court by grieving families. The stakes were staggering. Not only could he lose his reputation, but also his property, his license to practice, even his freedom. In the city of Rome, one such story unspooled in the crowded streets and smoky tenements. a tragedy that sent ripples through the world of medicine. The patient was young, struck by an infection that would not yield. Relatives, desperate, called the city's most prominent surgeon, a man known for steady hands and unblinking confidence. The family paid handsomely, hoping skill would buy salvation. But the operation went badly from the start. The surgeon, perhaps hurried or arrogant, made a wrong incision. Blood spilled, unstoppable. With every frantic attempt to staunch the flow, hope drained from the room. The patient died before the sun had fully set. Grief turned to fury. Roman law allowed families to seek justice. Surgeons, unlike most professionals, were personally liable for harm caused in their care. If the court ruled that the doctor had acted without proper caution or skill, the punishment was swift and severe. The surgeon was summoned, forced to answer for every decision, every trembling moment in the operating room. The court's verdict was a public spectacle. The doctor was found at fault. He was ordered to pay restitution far beyond what he could afford. In a matter of days, he lost everything. His home, once a place of learning and healing, was seized. His practice shuttered. Tools confiscated, medical texts sold at auction. Former patients vanished, seeking safer hands. The city's trust, once so carefully won, was shattered beyond repair. Friends drifted away, unwilling to risk association. In some regions, especially in medieval Islamic states, the law went further. A surgeon whose mistake led to death could be exiled, or even face corporal punishment. The message was unmistakable. Medicine was a public trust, and those who broke it paid in flesh, fortune, or freedom. Why did society demand so much? Because the stakes were life and death. A doctor's hands were entrusted with the most sacred of all possessions, a person's future, a family's hope. To lose a loved one was agony. To lose them through incompetence was a wound that begged for retribution. The law, by making doctors liable, was meant to keep them humble, careful, always striving for the highest standards. But the risk of public ruin cast a long shadow. Some physicians grew timid, refusing risky cases for fear of punishment. Others went underground, practicing in secret, or fled to distant towns where their reputations might not follow. A few, broken by loss, gave up medicine forever, haunted by the faces of those they could not save. Yet, through this harsh justice, the profession was refined. Every rule, every penalty, every bitter lawsuit served as a lesson, etched in law and memory, reminding doctors that with every patient, they walked the narrow road between healing and harm. The story of the ruined surgeon endures as a warning, a testament to the peril and nobility of medicine in a world where failure was not just a tragedy, but a public reckoning. The official who lost a census record and was punished. Beneath the vaulted halls of medieval bureaucracy, in candlelit rooms thick with parchment and ink, a class of men labored unseen. They were scribes, clerks, and record keepers, silent architects of order in kingdoms that teetered forever on the edge of chaos. Among them was a man named Radulf, the son of a minor official, who had risen by wit and diligence to the post of royal census scribe. It was not glory that motivated him, but the hope for stability, the promise that careful work and obedience would shield him from the storms that so often swept the poor and powerless away. Yet in a world ruled by paper, a single slip could doom a lifetime of labor. Radulf's task was immense, to track the souls and property of an entire province for the crown's taxation. Every field, household, child, animal, and tool was counted. Each detail entered in neat, meticulous script. The census was more than an administrative act. It was the foundation of royal power. Without these records, armies could not be raised, taxes could not be collected, justice could not be served. The king's reach extended only as far as the scribe's accuracy, and every page of the census was guarded as jealously as gold. In the fevered rush before the annual tax deadline, Rodolphe worked by firelight, his eyes red from sleepless nights, hands cramped from endless writing. When he finished the master census ledger, he stored it, so he thought, in the office strongbox, sealed with the city's emblem. But in his exhaustion, he overlooked a fatal detail. The box was not locked. In the confusion of the next morning, amid the comings and goings of petitioners and fellow clerks, the ledger vanished, stolen, misplaced, or perhaps accidentally destroyed in the ceaseless bustle of official life. Panic seized Rodolphe as the realization dawned. Without the record, the province's taxes would be delayed, royal soldiers would go unpaid, and suspicion would spread like wildfire through the court. At first, he tried to reconstruct the data from memory, but the scope was too vast and the margin for error too small. Word reached the king's council, and then the sovereign himself. The accusation was immediate: negligence at best, treason at worst. In an age where secrets were traded for power and every rival watched for weakness, the loss of a census ledger was a blow to the very heart of authority. Rodolphe was brought before the royal magistrate. The trial was swift, its outcome predetermined by fear and fury. To lose a state record was more than a personal failing. It was an offense against the crown. Rodolphe pleaded that he had meant no harm, that he was loyal, that the loss was an accident born of exhaustion and duty. But the laws of medieval governance were pitiless. The crown demanded a scapegoat, and Rodolphe became its sacrifice. He was stripped of his post, his title erased from the city rolls, his home and possessions seized to cover imagined losses to the royal treasury. The punishment did not end with disgrace. In accordance with the harshest statutes, Rodolphe was declared liable for the lost taxes and records, a debt so immense it could never be paid. In the cruel logic of the time, he was sold into bondage to work off what he owed, his labor claimed by the very system he once served. From scribe to slave, he vanished from official memory, his fate a cautionary tale for every clerk who held a pen. This story, though grim, was far from unique. Throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, officials entrusted with records lived and died by their accuracy. In Egypt, Rome, China, and across Europe, the loss or forgery of state documents was considered treason, punishable by exile, torture, or even death. The immense bureaucracy that enabled kings to rule was built on the backs of men like Rodolphe, whose lives could be ruined by a single accident. Their caution shaped the evolution of statecraft, inspiring new safeguards, double-entry systems, and entire institutions dedicated to preserving records against fire, theft, and human error. Yet still, the fear lingered. One misstep could destroy not only a career, but a life. In the quiet after his fall, Rodolphe's name became a whispered warning in the corridors of power, proof that even those who serve order with their whole soul can be swept away by chaos, punished not for malice, but for a moment's human frailty, forever erased from the ledgers they once so carefully kept. The actor who misspoke on stage and was fined into poverty. The theater of the ancient world was no gentle refuge. Its stage was not only a home for poetry and myth, but a battleground where reputations, fortunes, and even lives could be made or destroyed with a single word. For actors, every performance was a high-wire act above an unforgiving crowd, one in which applause could transform a nobody into a legend, and a simple mistake could unravel an entire existence. The story of the actor who misspoke on stage and was fined into poverty is a somber testament to how art, ambition, and power collided in the most brutal ways. He began, as so many did, a child of the streets, taken in by a troupe who saw talent in his mimicry and courage in his voice. He trained for years, learning to balance farce and tragedy, to move an audience from laughter to tears in a single scene. His first successes were modest, but the city's appetite for drama was endless, and his fame grew with every season. In time, he was chosen for more daring work, political plays, those sharp-edged productions that delighted and unsettled Rome's restless crowds. Political satire was both lucrative and perilous. Nobles sat in the front rows, masked but watchful, judging every line for its bite and its loyalty. The actor learned to walk the tightrope, lampooning the powerful just enough to win the crowd's favor, never enough to bring down true wrath. But in a world so charged with rivalry and suspicion, the margin for error was razor thin. It happened on a festival night, before a full house. The script, approved by censors, was filled with coded jokes and clever barbs, all meant to skirt the edges of offense. But as the play reached its climax, the actor stumbled. Whether from nerves or a slip of memory, his tongue twisted a line, turning a clever allusion into a pointed insult aimed squarely at a noble family, infamous for its temper and influence. The crowd fell silent. The laughter vanished, replaced by an icy tension that no amount of wit could dispel. By the next morning, the damage was done. The noble, his pride wounded and his authority questioned, summoned the leaders of the acting guild. To appease his fury, the guild had no choice but to turn on one of their own. They stripped the actor of his membership, denying him work on any stage within the city's walls. Worse, they imposed a staggering fine, ostensibly to show their loyalty to the elite, but in truth to make an example of him. Overnight, the applause he'd once earned was replaced by whispers of pity and derision. With no stage, no income, and now burdened with an impossible debt, the actor's world shrank rapidly. He sold his costumes, pawned the silver masks that once marked him as a star, and fled the city for the countryside. There, among strangers who neither knew nor cared for the dramas of the capital, he eked out a meager living, reciting poems in taverns, teaching children, working the land when he could find a master with a need for strong hands. His name, once shouted by adoring crowds, faded into obscurity, remembered only in the cautionary tales of young performers hoping to avoid his fate. The theater continued on, the city's appetite for spectacle undiminished. But every actor who took the stage after that night knew the risk, how a single error could turn favor to ruin, how power and pride could strike without warning. The story of the actor who misspoke lingered in the wings, an invisible warning that no role, however grand, could protect against the caprice of those above. He died in poverty, far from the lights of the stage, his art remembered only in the faded echoes of plays long since replaced. For some, his downfall was a reminder of the perils of ambition. For others, a symbol of how art and freedom are forever hostage to those who rule. His story endures, whispered in the shadows of every theater, a reminder that in a world where words can lift or destroy, the difference between triumph and tragedy may be just a single, accidental line.